June 5th, 2019. Vancouver, Washington. When 17-year-old Nikki Kuhnhausen wants to feel free, she posts a TikTok.
Everything will be alright.
Feel beautiful? She uploads a selfie on Instagram.
Everything will be just fine.
Lonely? Hits up the BFF on Snapchat.
Everything will be just fine.
But one ordinary summer day, all her social media posts suddenly stop. The first person to realize that something is wrong is Nikki's mother, Lisa.
Go ahead and bring that in.
It was Nikki's. Thank you. So at 8:34 on June 5th, Nikki called me. She told me she was at my friend's house. Called her at 11, because I always called her at 11. She texted me back, "I love you, Mommy." I said, "Honey, I have to be at work at 2. The next day, my message went unread. I thought, that's just weird. So I called and left another message. "You know, I need to talk to you. Where are you?" Nothing.
Nikki's older brother, Conrad, knows something is off.
Her not replying to our mom would never happen. Never. And she would always reply to her.
I was just getting voicemail after voicemail after voicemail. That's when I knew something was wrong.
Nikki and her mom are super close, an unbreakable bond, ever since she was a baby.
Nikki was always sassy. Here she's on her 3rd birthday. She would crawl around at my ankles when I was trying to get my makeup on while her brothers would be doing Mashbox. And she'd crawl out of the bathroom with makeup, and her 2 older brothers would say, "Mom, why'd you do that to Nikki again?" And I'm like, "I didn't. She did it to herself." You know, so she started way young.
Her other big brother, Alex, knew Nikki was truly unique early on.
Growing up, she always wore high heels and wearing makeup, wearing dresses, and, I'm playing with my G.I. Joes and she was playing with Barbie dolls.
In middle school is when she fully transformed into Nikki, and I never saw Nicholas again. There were no gay people in our life at all, and here's Nikki in the middle of it all. But it seemed natural. She just led us down her road and her journey of her life, and we followed,
A lot of people want to follow Nikki's journey, and she shares it openly on social media.
Look how they dress, looking at them.
She started on social media at 14.
She had Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, you name it, she used it.
Show your face, you're the party girl. Show your face, you're the party girl.
And, she was famous.
Show your face, you're the party girl. Show your face, you're the party girl.
It was incredible.
So by the time Nikki goes missing, in the early hours of June 6th, she has a community of loved ones who want answers. Her mother, Lisa, contacts authorities. But after 4 days, she becomes even more desperate after not hearing anything.
When I made the missing persons report, I told them, "You need to understand Nikki's being held against her will, or she's dead." Well, wait, let's not jump. And no, you need to jump. You need to go to that frame of mind in this case, because She wouldn't leave me alone this long. You have to understand.
With every second that goes by, Nikki's chances of being found safe slip away. For investigators in the Vancouver PD, the clock is ticking, but they have no leads.
My name is Sergeant Julie Ballou. I'm with the Vancouver Police Department in the Digital Evidence Cybercrime Unit. I knew that she was a transgender teen, and it's not uncommon for transgender youth and or LGBTQ youth in general to go missing or to run away. Oftentimes, though, it's because they don't have a supportive family at home. But she had a great relationship with her mom. She kept in touch with her friends. So when her social media accounts basically went dead, that was a big red flag for us. But we just don't have any leads to follow up on.
While the detectives begin their investigation, Nikki's loved ones push on every front to find her, turning to the social media sites that are Nikki's life.
I'm Taylor Watts, and I'm Nikki Kuhnhausen's best friend. We did Facebook posts, we made a group chat, it was on the news.
My name is Blair Stenvik. I'm a former news reporter for the Portland Mercury. I had been kind of consistently reported on LGBTQ plus issues for years. And so I knew that trans people are 4 times more likely from cisgender people to at some point become a victim of a violent crime.
Blair and other reporters spread the word. A young girl is missing, and leads start to pour in.
A lot of people were messaging me, giving me information. Saw her there and possibly spotted her here. Took a quick picture of someone on the corner. All the tips and the leads, and here and the there, and nothing.
Then, 7 days after she goes missing, investigators uncover their first major clue, and it's related to Nikki's Snapchat account.
On June 13th, Lisa contacts law enforcement and says that she's learned that Nikki has been staying with a couple of friends, Faith and Tiffany, at an apartment complex in Vancouver. They both agreed to come to the police department and speak with detectives.
Faith reveals a key detail, and the mystery of Nikki's disappearance takes an unexpected turn.
I think a lot of people were surprised with this information.
On June 5th, the last time Nikki Kuhnhausen is seen by her roommate Faith, Nikki borrows Faith's phone to log on to Snapchat and talk with a man who she meets up with several hours later. But Nikki then logs out of Faith's phone, and finding out who she spoke to is going to be tough.
Police officers can't just go to Snapchat and say, hey, give me all of her account information. You know, users have privacy rights, so we have to ask for those records by way of a search warrant.
So they do just that. They submit their search warrant, but Snapchat may hold fast. They may not give investigators the info they need. Weeks go by. But then, Snapchat comes through. And investigators find a name.
Nikki had been communicating with a man identified as David Bogdanov. He sent her an address. She said, okay. He said white van, LOL, and it sounded like the two were making arrangements to meet up. In addition to the communication, Snapchat recorded the information on where he was. As David was Snapchatting, he was outside of Nikki's apartment, picking her up.
But who is David Bogdanov?
Me personally, I didn't know too many details. I had not heard of him.
She isn't alone. David is a complete stranger to Nikki's family and friends. So the police dig in to find out everything they can about the 25-year-old.
David was from a very large Russian family. He had multiple brothers and sisters. He seemed to be involved in a family business in construction and flooring as his regular job. David didn't have a criminal history. Nothing showed up in his background that was an obvious red flag to us.
David looks clean, a model citizen. But Snapchat records clearly show him talking with Nikki the night she disappeared. And location data puts him right outside her apartment while they're messaging each other.
At this point in the investigation, David is definitely considered a person of interest. So the next step is trying to get a hold of David and asking what happened, what were the circumstances of your interaction with her. We made multiple attempts to try and get a hold of David. Phone calls and text messages and business cards left, and he was not returning our call. He was not getting back to us.
After nearly a week of not hearing from David, police turn their attention to his family.
So we first reached out to Artur, David's brother. He said that David was out backpacking and he wasn't there and wasn't quite sure how to get a hold of him or when he was going to return. So after talking to Artur, we contacted another brother, Stan. And Stan was kind of nervous and said on that night of question, he didn't really remember if David was even with him. And when he was asked about David backpacking, he sort of seemed surprised to learn that he might be backpacking. But even surprised that was even a suggestion. Given Stan's demeanor and the conflicting information that Stan gave versus Artur, it's possible that one of the brothers was involved or one of the brothers knew what happened. We didn't want to rule out anybody as a suspect at that point. But we had to keep trying and keep looking for David Bogdanov.
David isn't answering calls, responding to texts. More and more time passes. Is David still around? Did something happen to David too that night with Nikki? So police go back to the only lead they have. They turn to Snapchat. They message him through the app on September 5th, 3 months after Nikki went missing. And there's a glimmer of progress.
We sent David a Snapchat to say, hey, we'd like to talk with you. The message was read, so we believe that he saw the message, but we didn't get a response.
David's nowhere to be found. Complete radio silence. They Snapchat him again on September 12th, a week later. But this time, he responds the next day.
On October 2nd, 2019, David finally agrees to meet with Detective Jensen.
This is Detective David Jensen with Vancouver Police, and the date is October 2nd, 2019. I have with me David Bogdanov. David, do I have your consent to record this conversation?
Yep. David was the last person to see Nikki. Now, it's time to find out what he knows. Could he hold the key to bringing Nikki home alive? After 4 months with Nikki missing, detectives have their first lead.
Inside the darkest night.
Their first talk with a person of interest, David Bogdanov.
Some words I should have
But David doesn't have much insight.
They burn inside my head.
David said that he met her downtown in downtown Vancouver, struck up conversation with her, and he said he gave her his coat. They parted ways. She later reached out to him on Snapchat, and the two made arrangements to meet up. He said that they went to hang out with his brothers.
But David's brothers told the police they didn't know if they saw them that night. Someone's lying. But why? And then David says this, which piques the interest of the prosecutor's office.
My name is Kristen Arnault. I'm a deputy prosecutor here in Clark County. In that interview, he said that she mentioned that she was trans, and he immediately told her to get out of the car.
It's even disturbing when I'm around a gay person or somebody bi. I just got disgusted and I asked her to just get out. For me, it's just very disturbing and disgusting when people are like this. And that's it. That's where we parted ways. I went on to go to my brother's job site. From there, went to work.
So at that point, he says that she walked away. He volunteered, not responsive to really any questions, really derogatory things that he felt about people who are trans.
I wish I could help you more, but I'm not a kind of person to... I'm not even a violent person.
I don't know. It just seems it's troubling.
I know,
Because you're the very last guy that I don't want to say see her alive, because I don't really know if she's dead or alive. But I've got this mother who is living without this girl.
I can't make you stay.
However, even though things don't seem right, there isn't much that investigators can do.
Without a body, David Bogdanov, he was still a person of interest and not a suspect, which is why he walked away from that interview.
At this point in the investigation, we don't have really much else to go on.
Unfortunately, that soon changes.
The lights, they dim, black we were. Our last
And the worst case scenario happens.
we take that bow.
In our breaking news tonight, a hiker discovered a skull near a logging road on Larch Mountain.
A man was near Larch Mountain and is an area outside of Vancouver where people go to shoot guns regularly, to go hunting. This man was out in the boonies collecting fair grass, and while he was foraging in the forest, he came across what he believed to be human remains and called 911. The remains that were found out in the wilderness were basically bare bones. And it made it difficult for investigators to piece together what had happened.
Detectives scoured the area, spent 2 days out in the mountains, picking apart everything.
There's almost nothing left of the remains that can be used to identify the body. But based on items found scattered around it, police have a sneaking suspicion about who they've tragically found.
There was matching jewelry, matching clothing, black extensions with a white stripe. There was a pretty distinctive high-vis yellow jacket that coordinated with what images that we had of Nikki from social media.
Everyone's worst fears are soon confirmed.
My eyes close, and I go back to
With the forensic examination of the remains, we were able to confirm the remains to be Nikki Kuhnhausen. Our condolences go out to the family and friends of Nikki.
And when I found out they found Nikki's remains, I was at my mom's house. And I just cried, lost it. So it was very hard.
I fell on my knees and started screaming. This didn't have to be my baby. She's done a lot, she's gonna do a lot, but why did it have to be my baby?
You beat yourself up. A lot. A lot more than you should.
Nikki wasn't just a member of a grieving family. Heartbroken and angry over her story, people are inspired to act.
This is one of my favorite ones.
I love this one.
I think she's in 8th grade in that one.
Her eyebrows and makeup are just like on point. Wow. I am Lyndon Walls. I am a member of the Justice for Nikki Task Force, which was formed in late December 2019 after Nikki's remains were found. The goal of the task force was to make sure that Nikki's story was heard.
It is to build a coalition of activists and people from this community to come together, continue paying attention to this case, continue to make sure that media stays aware of what's going on.
And the task force stays true to honoring Nikki's legacy.
We just got information just a few minutes ago that there will be a vigil for Nikki this Friday from 5 to 7 at the Vancouver United Church of Christ.
We're at a standing room only. In fact, people are spilling out into the lobby. That is how packed it is. These people came out not only to support Nikki Kuhnhausen's family, but to also support the transgender community.
I gotta think of an escape, I gotta think of a plan.
March 2020, we all came together for Nikki's celebration of life. And her celebration of life was beautiful.
You could see how many people's lives were touched by Nikki, and people from all different walks of life.
Nikki always thought she was alone. And then when she passed away, seeing all those people was like, wow, she actually had all these people.
The outpouring of love was incredible.
People wanted answers. People wanted justice.
Supporters were commenting every day. People who knew her, as well as people who were, attached to the political side of things, really came together after Nikki's death to get justice for her.
And the first step is to find out how she died.
One of the items of evidence that the medical examiner reviewed was this phone charging cord that was found with Nikki's remains. And the phone charging cord was basically tied in a knot. And within that knot in the middle was tiny bone fragments as well as hair. The medical examiner, based on the evidence, they made a ruling that Nikki died of homicidal violence and the likely method was strangulation.
Now, the police are looking for a murderer. Detectives wonder, who had the motive to kill Nikki in such a brutal way? David Bogdanov is an obvious suspect. But Nikki's family has a secret to share. something that happened a year earlier.
When she was 16, I was at work, and the front manager comes over to relieve me and says, "You've got a call on the phone. It's a detective. It's something about Nikki." So I go to the phone. I said, "Hello." And they said that Nikki was at OHSU and she had been shot 6 times.
Someone wanted her dead. But who? And did they finally finish the job? A year before Nikki's disappearance, she's in the ICU, fighting for her life.
Standing helpless by my window tonight.
I was the longest drive from Vancouver to the hospital. The longest drive. She was shot once through here, missed the main artery right here, twice in the stomach, once through the neck, and once through the hand. Nikki was shot point blank range in the car and pushed out onto the street. They drove off. She crawled to the first house. They wouldn't open the door for her. So she crawled to the second house. And that's the last thing she remembers. She's a walking miracle.
Nikki never really talked about like who shot her or anything. She didn't get anybody involved.
They asked her who did it. She would always say, you know, he'll get his when he gets his.
Nikki remained silent, never pressing charges. So the police closed the case without ever conducting a full investigation into the shooting.
When Nikki went missing, I thought about who would want to harm her, and that's the only person that I could think of. With him not being apprehended, maybe he would want to do that again.
The police never do find out who made the attempt on Nikki's life. The shooter's identity remains a mystery. It's a dead end. With time passing by, and now desperate to find answers, police take another look at the last person Nikki messaged on social media. David Bogdanov.
David was, as far as we knew, the last person who had seen her alive.
David Bogdanov, a person of interest with no known connection to the body or the murder weapon, but with holes in his story. Conflicting accounts of what occurred the night of the disappearance. So police press further for more answers and uncover a startling truth.
We applied for a search warrant to Sprint, which was the carrier for David's cell phone at the time Nikki went missing.
They had graphed out where he had gone, and it was clear at that point that David had gone up to Larch Mountain the same day that Nikki went missing, which was not part of his original statement.
David told investigators he went right to work, but his phone took a trip to where Nikki Kuhnhausen's body was found. Investigators bring him in for questioning and confront him with cold, hard data.
I want to talk to you about a trip that you took before you went to the job site.
Is there anything that you want to revise before we continue on?
I mean, you might have stopped by the gas station.
So at the time that we talked, I didn't have the benefit of all of your phone records. Your phone went east, out past Larch Mountain.
You didn't just go to work, did you?
2 minutes after work.
Okay. All right. So understand that you're being arrested today for the murder of Nikki Kuhnhausen, whose remains have been discovered. Okay. Who was strangled to death.
Even though David is cornered, Nikki's loved ones and everyone following the case have an uneasy feeling.
I think there was an understandable worry that Nikki's killer might try to use the LGBTQ plus panic defense in court.
The trans panic defense is a way of saying I was in a mental state that I can't be held accountable because I was in such a blind rage by finding out that someone who I was in a sexual encounter with was trans. And that's so counter to my morals and existence that I flew into this rage and you can't hold me accountable.
Using this defense means that there's a possibility that David could get off scot-free just because she's transgender.
I couldn't even believe there was such a law that differentiated between my child and your child. My child's life was worth less because she was transgender.
So what is David's defense gonna be? With Nikki's friends and family watching, David drops a bombshell that no one sees coming.
I was shocked to hear what he said.
The life of a 17-year-old girl was taken far too soon. Over 2 years later, with the eyes of the world watching, David Bogdanov finally faces justice in court. But his story takes a wild turn.
Our client did not strangle Nikki Kuhnhausen, causing her death because she's transgendered. Nikki Kuhnhausen is now deceased because Mr. Bogdanov had to defend himself against her attacking him and possibly killing him.
The self-defense argument came at trial and not prior at any point. He'd never mentioned it.
I was shocked to hear him sit there and act like, it was him that was scared.
You see how big he is, and Nikki looks like she weighed 90 pounds. I mean, she was tough, but I don't think anybody thought that he was really needing to defend himself against her. It just doesn't seem like a plausible story.
When he chose to claim self-defense, he eliminated what was going to be one of the biggest hurdles in our case, proving that he was the person who did this.
So that took some of the burden off of the state. If he's admitting that he did it, it's more just, okay, what were the reasons surrounding why you claim you were justified in doing it?
And then, something else happens at trial that no one expects. Not by a long shot.
Your Honor, the defense calls David Bogdanov.
Raise your right hand. You solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give in these proceedings is the truth.
With his hand on a Bible, David Bogdanov is going to speak. Will it be the truth?
June 5th, 2019. It turned into the early morning of June 6th, 2019. Did you happen to meet a female walking down Main Street?
I did.
I'm David E. Gregerson, and I was the judge on the case of State versus David Bogdanov. It was always risky to put the defendant on the stand, and it was a gamble as to whether the jury would believe that version of events.
He said that he picked Nikki up from a friend's house.
Mr. Bogdanov said that they became physically involved sexually in the back seat, that Nikki performed oral sex on him.
As part of this hookup, he reaches into her pants and he realizes that Nikki is trans.
I freak out and just says she's a disgusting piece of crap. I shove her kind of hard. I turn and push her back to her driver's seat, and I keep telling her to just get the fuck out of my car.
Okay, then what does she do?
At that time, she just jumps up and goes towards the center console, towards my gun.
Colin Hayes, my co-chair, we both were a little surprised that a gun had been mentioned because we had no indication that a gun had ever been involved. And that's a completely different version of events than anything had been presented before.
He claimed she then began attacking him and that he was trying to restrain her, and he saw this cell phone cord that, according to him, was pre-tied, and then he thought that was a good way to try to continue restraining Nikki, and that it slipped up to her neck, and that is somehow how he claims her life ended.
Self-defense or a brutal crime. No one else was there to verify what the real story was. But sometimes actions speak louder than words.
He did not try to resuscitate or call aid for Nikki. Mr. Bogdanov didn't have great explanations for the steps or lack of steps thereafter that he took after strangling someone into submission.
And there's yet another shocking detail that comes out in David's testimony that doesn't seem to fit with his self-defense story.
He said that he was in the white van initially, and they had switched into a gold Audi.
He talked about having, this Audi vehicle that the encounter with Nikki happened in. I think that was a surprise to everyone.
Where's your Audi now?
I called a guy and told him where the Audi is and just told him to pick it up and just to get rid of it.
So you called somebody to make your vehicle disappear?
Yes.
And that was not a cheap vehicle, was it?
No.
And if the encounter, as he said, happened in the Audi and not the van, he definitely destroyed that evidence.
He killed Nikki. That is without question. The only reasonable explanation from the evidence here is that he killed her intentionally. That this is an act of rage, not an act of self-defense. This was murder.
The murder weapon being the phone cord with Nikki's wig hair tied into it in a manner that was not consistent with any type of struggle the way he described it. So it showed a very deliberate, in our mind, a very deliberate killing of Nikki.
He murdered this person because they were trans. There's no other way around it. And he now needs to go away from murder.
Nikki was killed on June 6th, 2019. On August 27th, 2021, 2 years, 2 months, and 19 days later, it's time for David to be judged.
We all came back into the courtroom for the verdicts, and everybody that was there for Nikki held hands in a line, and we all just sat there and prayed.
No one is sure if his story will be believed. And it isn't.
David Bogdanov was found guilty of murder in the second degree and malicious harassment.
When everything's been said, and we're lying here in bed.
When it said guilty, I was just in shock.
Oh, you seem so sure.
We were blessed on getting a guilty. It was amazing.
I'm falling to a plane.
I felt a lot of
Relief and happiness recognizing Nikki as a valued community member. And I felt glad that at least in the kind of messed up system we have, there was some justice served.
I was thankful that he was found guilty. Then once sentencing came around, I started getting mad about it. I was very, very disappointed in the justice system.
The judge sentenced him to 19 and a half years. That is the maximum that we could have gotten on this case, but it doesn't feel appropriate to the crime. A life was lost, and especially in this case, a very young life. It's always difficult because it's so hard to look at a family member and say, we got 19 and a half years.
To me, it wasn't fair, but I am glad he got the full sentence.
This is David Bogdanov's first offense, so he gets 19 and a half years. With good behavior, maybe he's out in 17. That's how old Nikki was when he killed her.
She was so beautiful and bright. And he wasn't sorry, not one little bit. Not one little bit. He was sorry he got caught.
Nikki Kuhnhausen was a light, a beacon. Her social media inspired transgender teens to find courage. She inspired a community to spread love in spite of hate. She inspired and changed history. Her family and advocates helped create a new law, the Nikki Kuhnhausen Act, which eliminates the gay and trans panic defense in the state of Washington, protecting countless LGBTQ plus lives.
Now this bill is not going to bring my daughter back, but what I hope is it will keep other families from experiencing the same kind of pain I feel.
Nikki lives on, and her story will now forever help others. A small piece of comfort for her family and loved ones.
Everybody loves her. You know, she is very loved, still very loved.
Social media was how Nikki showed her true self to the world. And in the end, social media was how Nikki caught her killer.
The rhythmic impact of hardened metal biting deeply into resistant wood is a sound that echoes with ancient familiarity in the isolated corners of the world. It is the steady, unyielding heartbeat of agricultural life, a percussive rhythm that resonates across valleys and through dense, humid foliage long before the morning sun manages to pierce the canopy. In these remote, tightly woven communities, this heavy, repetitive thud is never perceived as an intrusion. Instead, it is a foundational element of daily existence, a sonic representation of survival, ceaseless labor, and the perpetual subjugation of the surrounding wilderness. The instrument responsible for this rhythmic cadence, the machete, is inherently devoid of malice in its natural context. It is universally understood as a vital extension of the human arm, a crude yet perfectly calibrated implement born out of absolute necessity. Its broad, heavy, and often unforgiving blade is designed not for the delicate precision of a surgeon, but for the brutal momentum and sheer physical force required to tame nature. It is the tool that tirelessly clears overgrown, tangled paths that constantly threaten to choke the life out of small, vulnerable villages. It is the blade that forcefully splits thick firewood to ward off the encroaching, biting cold of the rural night. It is the edge that meticulously harvests the crops that have sustained generations of families living on the absolute margins of modern civilization. The physical reality of the machete is entirely utilitarian and deeply intimate to the laborer. Its handle, invariably smoothed and polished by years of accumulated sweat, dirt, and relentless friction, molds itself perfectly to the specific grip of its owner, becoming a personalized artifact of their daily toil. The blade itself tells a story of survival. It is often deeply pitted with the inevitable, creeping onset of rust, or permanently stained with the dark, oxidized sap of countless felled branches and harvested stalks. When lifted beneath the harsh, glaring light of the midday sun, the flat side of the heavy metal reflects the intense rays in brief, blinding flashes of cold illumination as it arcs downward through the heavy, suffocating air. If one were to observe this action in slow motion, the sheer physical toll of the labor becomes vividly apparent. Heavy, translucent drops of sweat gather on the furrowed brow of the worker, slowly tracing the deep lines etched by years of sun exposure before falling, suspended momentarily in the thick air, only to be violently disrupted by the sudden, downward velocity of the swing. The blade reaches the apex of its trajectory, hanging in the sky for a fraction of a second, before gravity and muscular force drag it downward with terrifying, unstoppable momentum. It connects with a solid branch, cleanly severing the wood in a single, devastating demonstration of kinetic energy. In this environment, the machete is life itself. It is the undeniable provider, the protector against the encroaching wild, and the absolute center of rural agricultural existence. Yet, there is a profound and deeply unsettling dichotomy woven into the very fabric of these small, isolated communities. The geographical remoteness that necessitates the constant use of such a heavy, utilitarian tool also creates a unique, often suffocating sociological environment. These are places defined by their inescapable proximity. They are villages where the concept of anonymity is entirely foreign, where the physical boundaries between homes offer no genuine barrier against the collective gaze of the community. It is a society built upon the foundation of intense, unwavering familiarity. Every face is known, every lineage is tracked, and every daily routine is subjected to the silent, collective observation of neighbors. This intense interconnectedness is frequently romanticized as a source of mutual support and idyllic rural solidarity. However, beneath this superficially comforting facade lies a far more complex and dangerous reality. The very lack of privacy that binds the community together simultaneously transforms the village into an inescapable, invisible prison. In a place where the entire village is intimately aware of what is served for dinner on a neighbor's table, the pressure to maintain an illusion of domestic perfection is immense and unyielding. This suffocating atmosphere acts as a psychological pressure cooker, slowly and imperceptibly building tension behind closed doors. The most potent weapon in this environment is not forged from iron or steel, but from the relentless, insidious nature of village gossip. The collective judgment of the community is a heavy, invisible shroud that dictates behavior and enforces silence. For the victims of domestic turmoil, this societal structure becomes a trap far more formidable than any physical barrier. The profound fear of public shame, the desperate need to preserve familial dignity, and the terrifying prospect of becoming the central subject of the village's collective scrutiny force individuals into a state of profound, agonizing silence. This is the hidden tragedy that unfolds in the bright, unforgiving light of day. It is visible in the subtle, desperate adjustments of clothing. It is seen when a spouse hurriedly pulls down the long, restrictive sleeves of a garment in the sweltering afternoon heat, a calculated, frantic movement designed to conceal the dark, blooming discoloration of a fresh bruise from the probing, curious eyes of a passing acquaintance. It is present in the strained, artificial smiles exchanged in the crowded, bustling spaces of the local market, where women gather in tight clusters, their conversations animated but their eyes constantly darting, silently evaluating and analyzing the subtle physical and emotional cues of their peers. The atmosphere in these communal spaces is thick with unspoken observation. Beneath the mundane exchanges about crop yields and weather patterns lies a current of intense scrutiny, where every hesitation, every averted gaze, and every unusual physical movement is catalogued and internally debated. When the sun finally dips below the horizon and the communal space is empty, the true weight of this isolation becomes palpable. The heavy wooden doors of the rural homes are pulled shut, their solid frames sealing away the outside world. But rather than offering a sanctuary of peace, These closed doors often trap the suffocating tension inside. The vibrant, noisy life of the village gives way to a heavy, oppressive silence, punctuated only by the ambient sounds of the nocturnal wilderness. Within these sealed environments, the pressure that has been meticulously suppressed throughout the day begins to fracture. The muffled, frantic cadence of desperate arguments bleeds through the porous walls, the words indistinct, but the tone unmistakably laden with fear and aggressive domination. The victims within these walls are profoundly alone, despite being surrounded by a community that theoretically knows everything about them. They are trapped in a terrible paradox, entirely visible to their society, yet completely unseen in their most desperate moments of terror. The community's collective choice to look away, to prioritize social harmony over individual safety, creates an environment of total impunity for the aggressor. It is within this terrifying intersection of physical isolation, suffocating social pressure, and absolute vulnerability that the nature of the agricultural tool undergoes a horrifying metamorphosis. The same heavy, rusted blade that is celebrated as the ultimate instrument of survival in the field suddenly shifts its context, becoming an instrument of unimaginable, intimate destruction within the confines of the home. The hands that are calloused from years of cultivating the earth, hands that are universally recognized for their capacity to nurture life from the soil, slowly wrap their familiar grip around the worn wooden handle of the machete with an entirely different, chilling intent. The transition from a tool of labor to a weapon of massacre is not merely a physical act, it is a profound psychological rupture. When the machete is raised inside the home, it brings with it the entirety of its brutal, unrefined physical characteristics. This is a tool that does not possess the capacity for neat, surgical damage. It is an instrument of blunt, devastating trauma. It does not simply pierce or cleanly cut, it brutally hacks, violently chops, and entirely obliterates whatever it strikes. When this overwhelming kinetic force, designed to sever thick tree branches and clear dense underbrush, is turned against human flesh and bone, the resulting destruction is absolute and catastrophic. The physical devastation inflicted by such a weapon is not merely an act of terminating a life, it is an act of total erasure. The sheer savagery required to wield a machete against a spouse speaks to a level of rage that transcends ordinary violence. It is a terrifying manifestation of a desire to completely destroy the victim's physical identity, to hack away at their very humanity until nothing recognizable remains. This impending violence casts a long, chilling shadow over the narrative, creating an atmosphere thick with an almost unbearable dread. The slow, rhythmic sound of metal striking wood, which once symbolized the comforting heartbeat of the village, begins to sound like a countdown to an inevitable atrocity. The heavy, labored breathing of the laborer in the field begins to parallel the terrified, shallow gasps of the victim trapped behind the heavy wooden door. The sudden, blinding flash of sunlight reflecting off the metal blade in the afternoon serves as a terrifying premonition of the darkness that will soon engulf the isolated home. And as this tension mounts to an agonizing peak, a profound and horrifying question hangs suspended in the stagnant, humid air of the village. It is a question that challenges the very foundation of the community's assumed safety and moral order. What happens to the delicate fabric of this tight-knit society when the very instrument responsible for their continued existence is repurposed to inflict the ultimate betrayal? What occurs when the familiar, comforting rhythm of agricultural labor is violently perverted into the chaotic, blood-soaked cadence of a domestic massacre? The transition from the open, sun-drenched fields to the suffocating, shadowed confines of the home marks the beginning of a descent into an abyss of unimaginable horror. This horror is not contained entirely within the frantic, terrifying moments of the attack itself. The true, lingering tragedy of this violence extends far beyond the physical destruction of the victim. The impending silence that will inevitably follow the violent clash of metal against bone is not a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, traumatic void. It is a silence that will be witnessed by those who are most vulnerable, hiding in the absolute darkest corners of the room, desperately pressing their small bodies against the cold, unyielding walls, are the silent observers of this total annihilation. The children of the household, trapped in the crossfire of this unimaginable rage, are forced to watch as the very concept of safety, love, and protection is brutally hacked to pieces before their wide, terrified eyes. The impending strike of the machete will not only sever the life of a parent, it will violently sever the children's connection to reality, leaving behind deep, jagged psychological scars that will bleed invisibly long after the physical wounds of the village have seemingly healed. The story that unfolds is an exploration of this terrible fracture, a journey into the dark, hidden spaces where the familiar tools of life become the architects of absolute, terrifying nightmares. To truly comprehend the terrifying circumstances surrounding the victims of these catastrophic domestic events, one must first entirely deconstruct the complex geographical and psychological architecture of the communities in which they are inextricably embedded. These locations are not sprawling, anonymous urban centers where a distressed individual can simply vanish into a moving crowd or reinvent their identity by relocating to a different district. Instead, these are isolated, intensely insular rural enclaves, characterized by a suffocating closeness that routinely masquerades as an idyllic, cooperative communal harmony. In these specific villages, the physical boundaries separating one property from another are extremely porous, often consisting of nothing more substantial than a low, rudimentary fence of woven branches or a shallow, muddy irrigation ditch. However, in stark contrast, the social boundaries governing behavior are impossibly rigid and completely impenetrable. Every single inhabitant is intimately aware of the exact lineage, the precise financial standing, the historical grievances, and the minutiae of the daily routine of everyone else residing within the village limits. To be born into, or to marry into, such a community is to be assigned a permanent, unyielding role within a highly complex, multi-generational social hierarchy that dictates every aspect of existence. For the victim of domestic abuse, this specific environment functions less like a supportive safety net and vastly more like an expansive, invisible panopticon. The deeply ingrained cultural habit of relentless observation means that every minor deviation from the accepted norm is immediately registered, meticulously cataloged, and subsequently dissected through the pervasive, whispering, and incredibly fast-moving network of village gossip. This omnipresent, collective scrutiny does not foster any genuine sense of safety. Instead, it cultivates a profound, paralyzing fear of public judgment. For a spouse enduring severe, escalating violence within the confines of their home, the outside world offers absolutely no genuine sanctuary. The collective, watchful gaze of the village is not a protective shield but rather a harsh, unforgiving spotlight that demands total compliance with social norms and punishes perceived domestic failures with severe, devastating social ostracization. Therefore, the victim learns very early on that physical and social survival depends entirely on the absolute, unwavering maintenance of a flawless public facade, forcing them to construct a thick, impenetrable wall of performative normalcy to shield their private, agonizing reality from the voracious, unforgiving curiosity of their neighbors. The daily portrait of the victim in these machete-driven domestic tragedies is almost universally defined by this exhausting, relentless, and desperate performance of normalcy. They are typically individuals deeply and actively woven into the fabric of the community's demanding agricultural and social life. They are regularly seen bargaining at the early morning markets. They participate heavily in the exhausting, back-breaking communal harvests, and they exchange polite, carefully measured pleasantries along the narrow dirt pathways connecting the homesteads. Yet, this public persona is a meticulously crafted, incredibly fragile illusion, sustained only through constant hypervigilance and profound physical discomfort. The data points consistently to the tragic, incredibly subtle physical manifestations of their deeply hidden reality. The victim's daily wardrobe is entirely stripped of personal expression and becomes, instead, a vital, strategic tool for physical concealment. Even as the midday sun beats down with a punishing, sweltering heat that defines the agricultural cycle, the victim will deliberately and consistently choose to wear heavy garments with long, restrictive sleeves and high collars. This is never a matter of simple modesty or arbitrary fashion, but rather a desperate, highly calculated necessity born of terror. The heavy fabric serves as a crucial, non-negotiable physical barrier, hiding the dark, blooming contusions, the fading yellowish marks of older, healed injuries, and the raw, tender abrasions that permanently map the brutal geography of their domestic terror. When passing a neighbor on the dusty road, or when reaching across a market stall to exchange currency, the victim instinctively, almost reflexively, pulls the cuff of the long sleeve down further toward their knuckles, a small, desperate, and deeply practiced gesture designed to ensure that the dark, violent secret remains completely hidden from the scrutinizing eyes of the community. This constant, exhausting physical hiding is mirrored by an equally draining psychological concealment. The victim must constantly and aggressively monitor their own spontaneous expressions, forcibly suppressing sudden winces of sharp pain, generating artificial smiles that never reach their deeply exhausted eyes, and carefully modulating the pitch and tone of their voice to ensure that absolutely no trace of the underlying, constant panic bleeds into their mundane public interactions. They are entirely consumed by the monumental effort of simply appearing fine, expending massive amounts of precious emotional and physical energy just to prevent the village from confirming the terrible, violent reality that everyone perhaps already suspects but collectively, silently chooses to ignore in the name of communal peace. The threshold of the victim's home, therefore, represents a terrifying, highly definitive transition point between two completely different nightmares. While the heavy, solid wooden door serves effectively to block out the prying, judgmental eyes of the village, it simultaneously and fatally seals the victim inside a private, inescapable chamber of horrors where the normal rules of human social conduct are entirely suspended. The interior of the house is permanently defined by an atmosphere of dense, suffocating, and entirely unpredictable volatility. Within this confined space, the ordinary, everyday objects of domestic and agricultural life take on a menacing, highly sinister duality. Chief among these deeply compromised objects is the machete itself. In the context of the vibrant village outside, the machete is universally recognized as a symbol of laborious survival, an absolutely indispensable tool required for clearing thick brush, chopping firewood, and harvesting essential crops. But inside the sealed home, leaning casually against the dark corner of a room, resting heavily on a rough-hewn wooden table, or hanging silently from a rusted nail on the wall, its meaning is entirely, horrifyingly subverted. For the victim, the mere physical presence of the machete is a constant, screaming, silent threat. It is a physical, undeniable manifestation of the aggressor's absolute power and their terrifying capacity for total, unmitigated destruction. The victim lives every waking second with the agonizing, sickening awareness that the distance between the heavy tool's utilitarian, life-sustaining purpose and its potential use as a weapon of absolute massacre is perilously, terrifyingly thin, bridged only by the unpredictable, explosive, and entirely unchecked temper of their spouse. The immense physical weight of the thick blade, the terrifying sharpness of its well-maintained edge, and the devastating kinetic force it represents are deeply, permanently etched into the victim's highly traumatized consciousness. They are forced to navigate the physical space of their own home with an acute, exhausting hypervigilant awareness of the machete's exact location at all times, their nervous system perpetually primed for the terrifying, inevitable moment when the heavy metal is lifted not for agricultural work, but in a sudden, blinding, inescapable arc of uncontainable, lethal rage. This environment of sustained, high-level terror fundamentally and systematically erodes the victim's core sense of self, completely dismantling their identity and reducing their entire existence to a pathetic series of calculated, desperate maneuvers designed merely to survive until the next sunrise. Tragically, the profound devastation caused by this suffocating, violent environment is never limited solely to the two adults locked in this deadly, escalating dynamic. The most vulnerable, the most defenseless, and ultimately the most devastatingly impacted residents of these specific households are the children. The underlying data highlights a horrific, deeply unsettling reality. These impending massacres, driven by the brutal, unforgiving force of a heavy machete, frequently and tragically unfold in the direct, unavoidable presence of the household's youngest, most impressionable members. Long before the final, catastrophic incident of ultimate violence even occurs, these children exist as silent, terrified prisoners trapped completely within the highly pressurized cooker of the family home. They are the unseen, entirely forgotten victims of the village's collective, willful blindness. Long before the physical violence reaches its ultimate, inevitably lethal crescendo, the children are constantly absorbing the thick, ambient terror that saturates their daily environment. They learn, out of sheer survival instinct, to perfectly interpret the subtle, highly dangerous shifts in the household atmosphere. They can instantly recognize the sudden, chilling drop in their parents' vocal tone. They memorize the heavy, aggressive, purposeful footsteps echoing across the wooden floorboards, and they flinch internally at the terrifying, metallic sound of the heavy machete scraping against wood as it is casually, threateningly moved by the abuser. Because the surrounding village explicitly demands absolute public normalcy, these isolated children are entirely and systematically deprived of any safe outlet for their overwhelming, constant fear. They understand, with a chillingly premature and deeply tragic intuition, that the dark, violent secret of their home must be kept hidden at absolutely all costs, lest they bring shame upon the family. Consequently, they become absolute masters of invisibility within their own living space. They instinctively learn to shrink into the darkest, most obscure corners of the house, desperately attempting to make themselves as small, quiet, and unnoticeable as humanly possible whenever the domestic tension violently escalates. They sit in agonizing silence and watch their targeted, victimized parent desperately try to manage the entirely unmanageable, silently observing the frantic, hurried pulling down of sleeves and the desperate, painful covering of dark bruises. This constant, unrelenting exposure to profound physical vulnerability and absolute, unchecked domestic aggression fundamentally and permanently shatters their foundational understanding of human safety and trust. For these silent children, the concept of home is entirely devoid of warmth or sanctuary. It is strictly a volatile, terrifying battlefield where they are entirely defenseless, waiting in agonizing, paralyzing silence for the inevitable, tragic moment when the heavy blade finally falls and their entire worldview is violently, permanently, and irrevocably severed. The descent of absolute darkness over these geographically isolated and tightly enclosed rural villages brings with it a profound shift in the domestic landscape, marking the ominous transition from the public performance of community harmony to the private, unvarnished reality of domestic terror. In these highly insular settlements, where the collective eye of the village dictates every aspect of daytime behavior, the arrival of the night effectively seals the inhabitants within their modest dwellings, transforming individual households into completely detached, independent spheres of existence. It is within this nightly confinement that the accumulated psychological pressures, the unspoken hostilities, and the systemic cycles of domestic violence that have been building like a pressure cooker behind closed doors begin to dangerously fracture the fragile veneer of normalcy. The incident does not materialize out of thin air. Rather, it is the catastrophic culmination of a steady, unmistakable escalation that unfolds within the claustrophobic confines of the family home. The confrontation typically initiates with a sudden, palpable shift in the domestic atmosphere as the superficial peace of the household dissolves into a bitter, highly charged verbal dispute between the husband and the wife. Because the physical architecture of these rural homes features thin, porous walls and compact spaces, the internal pressure of the conflict rapidly intensifies, leaving absolutely no neutral ground or physical escape routes where either individual can retreat to de-escalate the mounting fury. The verbal exchange quickly sheds any remaining remnants of restraint, escalating into loud, unbridled expressions of absolute rage and profound personal animosity. In this highly volatile environment, the historical grievances and the deeply ingrained power imbalances of the relationship converge to strip away the regular boundaries of domestic conduct, replacing years of shared intimacy with a terrifying, immediate adversarial dynamic that primes the physical space for an imminent, terminal eruption of violence. As the verbal confrontation reaches its absolute peak of emotional volatility, the physical trajectory of the incident alters fundamentally and fatally the moment the aggressor makes the conscious, definitive decision to engage the primary agricultural tool of the household as a lethal weapon. The introduction of the machete into the domestic dispute is a moment of profound, irreversible transition, shifting the encounter from an episode of severe physical abuse into a full-scale, unmitigated massacre. In the context of these small villages, the machete is an omnipresent, completely mundane object that typically rests casually in the corner of a room, leans heavily against a wooden kitchen table, or hangs silently from a rusted nail on the wall, serving as a constant, material reminder of the family's daily reliance on manual labor. When the hand of either the husband or the wife deliberately wraps around the worn, sweat-smoothed wooden handle of this heavy tool in the midst of an argument, the functional identity of the object undergoes a sudden, horrifying perversion. The victim is instantly confronted with the ultimate, terrifying manifestation of their absolute vulnerability within the home. The physical reality of the weapon, its thick, heavy steel blade, its cold, unyielding surface, and the substantial manual momentum it represents, instantly dominates the small room, effectively casting a literal and metaphorical shadow over any possibility of successful defense. The realization of what is about to transpire inflicts an immediate, paralyzing psychological trauma upon the victim, who is forced to recognize that the very implement used daily to cultivate life and sustain the family's survival is now being hoisted into the shadowed air of the room with the explicit, terrifying intent to violently and permanently extinguish their existence. The actual physical execution of a domestic massacre carried out with an agricultural machete is characterized by an absolute, unrefined physical savagery that fundamentally differentiates it from crimes involving modern firearms or smaller, concealable blades, resulting in what the historical data explicitly describes as devastating injuries that are entirely destructive in nature. This catastrophic level of trauma is dictated directly by the unique physical design and structural mechanics of the machete itself. Unlike a standard knife or a sharp household implement, which is engineered primarily to puncture or cleanly slice through material, a machete is explicitly designed to chop, cleave, and hack through dense, highly resistant materials like thick wood and dense jungle underbrush through the sheer application of manual weight and kinetic momentum. When this immense physical force is turned against human flesh, muscle, and bone within the restricted confines of a small room, the resulting destruction transcends the basic objective of homicide, manifesting instead as an act of total, chaotic physical erasure. Every single downward strike of the heavy, wide blade represents a massive accumulation of unchecked, primitive rage, delivered with enough physical velocity to shatter skeletal structures and completely sever tissue. The violence is inherently intimate and exhausting, requiring the attacker to remain in immediate, breathing proximity to the victim, sustaining the brutal assault through multiple, repetitive, and deliberate swings of the arm. The injuries inflicted upon the spouse are absolutely catastrophic, causing an immediate, irreversible mutilation of the physical body that systematically dismantles the victim's human appearance. This level of extreme physical devastation speaks directly to the profound depth of the perpetrator's internal hostility, where the tool of daily labor is repurposed to systematically hack away at the very identity and physical form of their partner until nothing recognizable remains of the person they once built a life alongside. As the horrific assault actively progresses, the interior of the home undergoes a rapid, chaotic transformation, completely mirroring the total collapse of human order and moral restraint within its walls. The thin boundaries of the domestic sphere offer absolutely no protection or sanctuary as the violent struggle spills chaotically across the small rooms. The terrifying sound of heavy wooden furniture being violently upended, the sharp, percussive shattering of basic household items against the floorboards, and the heavy, desperate impact of bodies colliding with the concrete walls signify a frantic, entirely unavailing struggle for survival. The victim, completely outmatched by the overwhelming physical reach and the devastating, heavy momentum of the long blade, is rapidly forced into a purely defensive, desperate posture, instinctively attempting to ward off the incoming strikes with bare hands and forearms, an act that unfortunately results in further incapacitating, devastating wounds. The compact rooms of the rural dwelling effectively become a closed, inescapable trap, where every piece of familiar domestic furniture, the tables where the family gathered for daily meals, the chairs where they rested after exhausting hours in the fields, now functions as a physical obstacle that actively prevents flight or evasion. The walls of the house, which are culturally meant to symbolize safety, shelter, and familial security, instead become the rigid, unyielding barriers that pin the victim in place, ensuring that there is absolutely no exit from the descending, rhythmic arc of the heavy metal blade. The physical chaos within the space is absolute and overwhelming as the heavy, wet thuds of the machete connecting with its target continuously punctuate the terrifying sounds of the physical struggle, creating a dense, suffocating environment of pure terror where the basic human instinct to survive is systematically crushed by an unstoppable, heavy physical force. The most deeply haunting and socially profound dimension of these specific domestic massacres is the absolute, unavoidable reality that the terrifying violence frequently unfolds directly in the immediate presence of the young children of the household. Trapped completely within the very same small rooms, entirely powerless to intervene and completely unable to escape the unfolding nightmare, these children are forced by circumstances to become the direct, eyewitness observers to the total, violent annihilation of their entire familial unit. Hiding in the absolute darkest, most obscure corners of the living space, desperately wedging their small, trembling bodies behind basic furniture or pressing themselves flat against the cold, unyielding concrete walls, they sit in a state of complete, catatonic behavioral paralysis. Their wide, unblinking eyes are forced to absorb the incomprehensible and deeply traumatic spectacle of one parent systematically and brutally destroying the other with a heavy agricultural tool that they see utilized every single day for mundane chores. The children do not merely witness the mechanical act of homicide, they absorb the full, concentrated weight of the unbridled rage, the terrifying sounds of the physical impact, and the absolute vulnerability that completely saturates the air of their home. They watch the frantic, hopeless movements of their mother or father trying desperately to evade the heavy blade, and they witness the unstoppable, devastating impact of the machete as it inflicts permanent, catastrophic destruction upon the individual who represents their primary source of emotional safety, sustenance, and love. This intense visual and emotional exposure inflicts an immediate, profound psychological trauma that completely tears apart the foundational cognitive architecture of the child's mind, permanently shattering their basic understanding of human relationships, familial security, and physical safety within a matter of minutes, leaving them entirely psychologically marooned. When the frantic, chaotic energy of the domestic massacre finally expends itself, and the final, devastating blow of the heavy agricultural machete has been delivered, a sudden, heavy, and deeply unnatural silence crashes down upon the interior of the ruined home. This immediate stillness is not a peaceful or comforting quiet, but a thick, suffocating, and deeply traumatic void that signifies the absolute completion of the physical destruction within the space. The violent sounds of shattering household items, the desperate struggles for breath, and the sharp, metallic resonance of the heavy blade have entirely ceased, leaving only the ambient, completely indifferent sounds of the surrounding rural night, the steady chirping of crickets outside the house, and the rustling of wind through the trees, to filter through the porous cracks of the wooden walls. In this heavy, oppressive silence, the sheer physical reality of what has occurred becomes absolute and irreversible. The perpetrator stands frozen in the center of the completely ruined living space, suddenly engulfed by the immediate, crushing psychological aftermath of their own unbridled, primitive rage, while the heavy, blood-stained gardening tool remains in their grasp as a material testament to the total erasure of life. However, this profound, unnatural silence within the household is eventually, tragically broken by the only remaining human sound left inside the structure, the low, continuous, and completely heartbroken sobbing of the surviving children. Creeping slowly and tentatively out from their hiding places in the dark corners, their small, shaking voices cut through the heavy, stagnant air of the room as they confront the absolute, bloody ruin of their family. This solitary sound of a child crying in the darkness emphasizes the total, sweeping nature of the tragedy, highlighting that while the physical violence of the incident has reached its definitive and lethal conclusion, the immense, lifelong psychological and emotional aftermath is only just beginning to unfold within the permanently ruined sanctuary of the home. The transition from a hidden, nocturnal atrocity to an official, systematic criminal investigation begins with the first cold rays of dawn slowly cutting through the thick, stagnant fog that routinely settles over these geographically isolated rural communities. When the local investigative team finally arrives at the scene, navigating their vehicles along the narrow, unpaved dirt tracks that serve as the village's only connection to the outside world, they are immediately forced to confront the absolute collapse of the boundaries that normally separate private domestic life from public communal space. The physical reality of the massacre is not neatly contained behind the solid wooden doors of the residence. Instead, the final, terrifying moments of the struggle have violently spilled outward onto the dirt of the front yard, leaving a massive, dark pool of blood completely exposed to the morning air, staining the very earth that the community relies upon for its daily survival. Surrounding this grim, horrific centerpiece is a dense, motionless perimeter of local villagers who have gathered in the early hours, standing shoulder to shoulder in absolute silence, forming an impenetrable human wall around the edge of the property. The atmosphere within this gathering is thick with an agonizing, almost paralyzing social tension, as individuals who have known both the perpetrator and the victim for their entire lives watch the authorities unpack their physical markers and unravel bright perimeter tape across the familiar landscape. The investigators immediately note a profound psychological paradox defining the crowd. While these onlookers possess an intimate, lifelong familiarity with every aspect of the victim's household, their eyes deliberately and uniformly look away from the blood on the ground, maintaining a rigid, defensive posture that suggests a collective attempt to close ranks and protect the village's internal mechanics from the cold, clinical scrutiny of outside legal authority. Stepping carefully across the threshold into the small, shadowed interior of the family home, the forensic technicians begin the grueling, step-by-step documentation of a space that has been entirely transformed into a chaotic landscape of absolute physical destruction. The rooms present a terrifying material narrative of the crime, with heavy wooden furniture violently upended, basic household items shattered across the floorboards, and personal belongings scattered haphazardly, tracing the frantic, desperate path of the victim's failed attempt to find a single avenue of escape from the descending violence. At the absolute center of this forensic reconstruction is the recovered weapon itself, the heavy agricultural machete, left casually at the scene as a mute, terrifying testament to the total rupture of human restraint. The investigators carefully document the physical properties of the blade, analyzing how the wide, heavy steel surface, which just hours prior was utilized as an indispensable tool for clearing thick brush and harvesting crops, is now completely coated in the deep, undeniable evidence of the assault. By examining the deep, jagged indentations carved into the wooden walls and tracking the complex patterns of blood splatter across the ceiling and concrete floor, the forensic team is able to scientifically reconstruct the immense kinetic force behind each downward stroke of the weapon. The physical data confirms that the machete was wielded not with surgical precision, but with a primitive, unbridled momentum that delivered wounds of an inherently and totally destructive nature, systematically dismantling the victim's physical form through multiple, repetitive impacts that required an exhausting amount of raw muscular exertion from the attacker, proving beyond any legal doubt that the incident was fueled by an absolute, consuming rage designed to entirely erase the partner's identity. As the meticulous physical processing of the structure draws to a close, the investigation shifts into its most challenging phase, initiating the detailed interviews of the surrounding neighbors, a process that immediately plunges the authorities into a frustrating, highly complex psychological quagmire. In a tightly closed village, where true privacy is an impossibility and where the daily routines of every individual are constantly observed by the collective eye of the community, the investigators logically expect to gather a wealth of detailed observational data regarding the timeline of the attack. Instead, they run headfirst into a uniform, completely impenetrable wall of collective silence and sudden, widespread amnesia that characterizes the adult population. When questioned individually within the quiet confines of their own properties, neighbors whose homes are situated mere meters away, close enough to hear the simplest conversation through the thin, porous walls, claim with an unsettling, rigid consistency that they heard absolutely nothing unusual during the fateful night, noticed no warning signs in the period leading up to the tragedy, and possessed no knowledge of any domestic volatility within the household. This total refusal to cooperate is not born out of a genuine desire to protect a violent killer from facing justice, but rather from a deeply ingrained, culturally enforced mandate to safeguard the collective reputation of the village and preserve the delicate illusion of communal harmony at all costs. The investigators quickly realize that the unwritten social contract of this insular society dictates that internal family conflicts must remain completely buried, and to speak openly to outside authorities would be viewed as a catastrophic betrayal of the community's foundational structure, turning this collective denial into the most formidable obstacle of the entire legal inquiry. Faced with the absolute, unyielding silence of the adult villagers, the trajectory of the investigation is ultimately forced to turn toward the most tragic and legally critical source of direct evidence available: the young children of the household who were trapped inside the small rooms throughout the entire duration of the massacre. The process of conducting forensic interviews with these youngest survivors represents a harrowing, deeply delicate operation, requiring the investigators to entirely abandon traditional, aggressive questioning techniques and instead adopt a patient, intensely empathetic approach tailored to minds experiencing a state of acute, catatonic psychological trauma. Sitting in small, isolated rooms away from the piercing gazes and hushed whispers of the townspeople, the authorities are confronted with a heavy, heartbreaking silence from children whose foundational understanding of human safety has been violently shattered before their eyes. The children do not communicate their experiences through a fluid, structured narrative. Rather, their testimony emerges in deeply fractured, minimalist sentences, heavily punctuated by long periods of vacant staring and sudden, uncontrollable fits of weeping. They describe the horrific events of the night through the visceral, unforgettable sensory details that have been permanently seared into their young consciousness: the heavy, rhythmic thud of their father's footsteps moving across the creaking floorboards, the terrifying metallic sound of the long gardening blade being lifted from its usual resting place against the wall, and the desperate, fading cries of their mother in the pitch darkness of the room. The investigators document these fragile accounts with absolute precision, recognizing that the children's raw, unvarnished descriptions provide the definitive legal timeline of the tragedy, bridging the gap between the silent physical evidence of the machete and the immense human horror of the domestic slaughter. The profound turning point of the entire investigation, the central narrative twist that completely recontextualizes the true nature of the case, materializes when the authorities look past the immediate physical evidence of the night and begin to dig deeply into the long-term historical background of the family's existence within the village. By meticulously cross-referencing the tiny, involuntary discrepancies in the neighbors' initial statements and analyzing the older, weathered physical damage hidden within the structure of the home, the investigators unearth a terrifying reality. This catastrophic explosion of violence was never a sudden, spontaneous, or unpredictable anomaly, but was instead the entirely inevitable conclusion of a severe, long-standing pattern of domestic terror that the entire community had actively, consciously chosen to ignore for years. The investigation reveals that the village's carefully performed wall of ignorance was a deliberate social fabrication, as neighbors had, in fact, routinely observed the explicit warning signs of impending disaster. They had seen the victim consistently wearing heavy, long-sleeved garments in the stifling summer heat to conceal severe bruising. They had witnessed the sudden, terrified silences that immediately descended over the local market stalls whenever the perpetrator walked past, and they had listened to the muffled, agonizing arguments echoing through the thin walls on countless previous occasions. The true, devastating twist of the case is the realization that the community's obsession with performative normalcy and their absolute fear of public gossip had functioned effectively as a systemic accomplice to the homicide, because by enforcing a rigid social code that prioritized collective appearance over individual safety, the village had systematically dismantled every potential avenue of help or escape for the victim, leaving them entirely marooned inside a volatile domestic prison, until the pressure cooker inevitably erupted into absolute ruin. The formal translation of a private domestic massacre into a public judicial record represents a profound and jarring shift in the narrative, moving the focus of the tragedy away from the shadowed, humid confines of the rural village and placing it directly beneath the harsh, clinical illumination of a modern provincial courtroom. This institutional space, defined by its rigid architectural lines, its polished wooden benches, and its absolute adherence to codified legal procedures, stands in complete and uncompromising contrast to the organic, insular world where the crime originally materialized. When the trial proceedings officially commence, the courtroom gallery is immediately filled to absolute capacity by the inhabitants of the isolated village, who have traveled en masse to witness the state's processing of their former neighbor. The presence of these villagers creates an underlying atmosphere of intense, almost suffocating social anxiety within the courtroom, as individuals who have spent their entire lives enforcing a strict, unwritten code of absolute domestic privacy are now forced to sit in a public arena and listen to the most intimate, terrifying secrets of their community being systematically dismantled and exposed to the public record. They sit shoulder to shoulder in defensive silence, their faces masks of rigid discomfort, realizing that the protective wall of performative normalcy they had collectively constructed to shield their village's internal failures has been entirely and irrevocably shattered by the machinery of the legal system. At the absolute center of this legal arena sits the defendant, positioned within the security of the prisoner's dock and subjected to the collective, unblinking scrutiny of the court, presenting a psychological study in profound degradation and absolute displacement. Within the small, isolated universe of the family household, this individual had operated for years as an unchallenged, all-powerful domestic tyrant, utilizing the constant threat of severe physical violence and the overwhelming weight of social intimidation to maintain total domination over their spouse and children. However, beneath the indifferent gaze of the judicial system, that manufactured aura of absolute power is completely stripped away, revealing a pathetic, deeply diminished figure who appears entirely untethered from the environment of control they once commanded. The defendant's physical demeanor throughout the trial is characterized by a heavy, uncommunicative stillness, their eyes consistently fixed on the floor or directed blankly toward the defense table, actively avoiding any direct visual contact with the gathered villagers or the legal representatives. This dramatic shift from an aggressive, all-powerful abuser of the home to a passive, submissive subject of state authority underscores the profound psychological rupture that occurs when the private structures of domestic tyranny are forced to confront the cold, impartial realities of institutional justice, leaving the perpetrator completely exposed and entirely unable to rely on the community's traditional silence to evade accountability. The true gravity of the crime is brought into sharp, undeniable focus when the prosecution officially introduces the primary physical evidence of the massacre, presenting the heavy agricultural machete to the court as the central exhibit of the state's case. The physical manifestation of this tool within the formal space of the courtroom inflicts an immediate, palpable shock upon the gathered villagers in the gallery, as they are forced to look at an object that represents a completely mundane, indispensable element of their own daily survival now tagged and preserved as an instrument of absolute slaughter. The wide, heavy steel blade, which bears the permanent, dark discolorations of forensic processing alongside the deep structural damage incurred during the violent assault, is displayed before the judges as a material testament to the total collapse of human restraint. The prosecution meticulously traces the history of the tool, emphasizing how its specific physical properties, its substantial manual weight, its extended length, and its devastating capacity for kinetic momentum were deliberately and maliciously redirected away from the cultivation of the land and turned against the vulnerable body of the partner. By forcing the court to confront the physical reality of the machete, the prosecution effectively establishes the foundational thesis of their legal argument, demonstrating that the choice to utilize such a heavy, destructive agricultural implement within the tight confines of a home constitutes an explicit, undeniable proof of lethal intent and absolute malice. To substantiate this claim of total, unmitigated intent, the state calls upon a series of forensic experts and medical examiners who provide a highly detailed, step-by-step scientific reconstruction of the physical mechanics behind the massacre. These professionals deliver their testimony in a cold, clinical, and completely objective manner, using large anatomical diagrams and precise ballistics and scatter analysis to map the terrifying geography of the violence that transpired within the home. The forensic data reveals that the injuries inflicted upon the victim were entirely destructive in nature, characterized by deep skeletal fractures and catastrophic tissue damage that could only be achieved through the application of immense, repetitive physical force. The medical examiner systematically disproves any potential defense claim that the incident was a sudden, accidental escalation or a brief, uncontrolled lapse in judgment, demonstrating instead that the sheer number and distribution of the wounds required a sustained, physically exhausting expenditure of muscular energy from the attacker. The presentation details how each downward strike of the heavy machete was delivered with maximum velocity, tracing a deliberate pattern of assault that was designed to completely incapacitate and ultimately erase the physical identity of the spouse, leaving the court with an unvarnished, scientifically irrefutable portrait of a calculated execution that left absolutely no room for survival. The narrative of the trial undergoes an intense, socially revealing complication when the prosecution systematically calls the adult neighbors to the witness stand, exposing the profound conflict between the village's deep-seated culture of collective denial and the uncompromising demands of legal truth. As these witnesses take the stand, they attempt to replicate the same impenetrable wall of silence and sudden amnesia that they had previously presented to investigators, offering vague, evasive testimonies that minimize their awareness of the domestic volatility within the household. However, beneath the sharp, relentless cross-examination of the state's attorneys, this performative ignorance rapidly and embarrassingly disintegrates before the court. The prosecution systematically confronts the villagers with the undeniable physical realities of their environment, demonstrating through structural measurements and acoustic testing that it was entirely impossible for them to have remained unaware of the severe, prolonged arguments and the physical violence occurring mere meters away through the thin, porous walls of the homes. The witnesses are forced to slowly admit that they had indeed observed the explicit warning signs, the victim's constant concealment of injuries under heavy clothing in the sweltering heat, the terrified atmosphere of the family property, and the auditory evidence of domestic terror, proving that their collective decision to remain silent was a conscious social choice to protect the village's public appearance at the direct expense of a human life, thereby laying bare the systemic complicity of the community before the entire court. The emotional and legal climax of the entire judicial proceeding is reached when the court addresses the testimony of the household's young children, a moment handled with extreme systemic care that nevertheless delivers the most devastating blow to the defense's position. To protect the children from the severe psychological trauma of confronting their abusive parent in open court, their forensic depositions are presented through a detailed, meticulously verified legal record, allowing their raw, unvarnished accounts of the massacre to echo through the silent room. The reading of the children's testimony inflicts a profound, collective heartbreak upon the courtroom, as the absolute horror of the crime is described entirely through the limited, highly focused vocabulary of its youngest, most traumatized survivors. The children's accounts provide the court with an absolute, minute-by-minute timeline of the tragedy, detail by detail, describing how they watched from the pitch-black security of their hiding places as the familiar agricultural tool was pulled from the wall and used to systematically destroy their family structure. Their descriptions of the terrifying sounds, the heavy, purposeful footsteps of the abuser, the sharp impact of metal against wood, and the final, fading cries of their mother, are presented with a raw, undeniable clarity that completely strips away any remaining legal ambiguity, providing the definitive moral and factual anchor for the prosecution's case and rendering any argument for leniency completely unviable. Faced with an overwhelming accumulation of physical, forensic, and eyewitness evidence, the defense is forced to adopt a highly restricted, desperate mitigation strategy that attempts to shift the moral blame away from the inherent malice of the perpetrator and onto the oppressive sociological conditions of the environment. The defense attorneys argue that the defendant was a product of severe, prolonged economic isolation and intense psychological pressure generated by the suffocating, closed nature of the agricultural village, suggesting that the lack of external resources, the absence of mental health support, and the relentless scrutiny of the community had combined to create an environment where the individuals simply snapped under the weight of existential despair. They attempt to frame the choice of the machete not as a calculated selection of a lethal weapon, but as a tragic, spontaneous consequence of its omnipresence within the household, arguing that the tool was merely the closest object available in a moment of unthinking, temporary insanity. However, this line of argumentation fails completely to resonate with the judges or the gallery, as it is systematically dismantled by the prosecution's reminder that poverty and isolation do not inherently dictate the savage, prolonged destruction of a human being, and that the long-standing pattern of hidden abuse exposed during the investigation proves that the final massacre was the deliberate, premeditated climax of a tyrant's choices rather than an unpredictable psychological anomaly. The trial reaches its definitive and absolute conclusion with the formal reading of the verdict and the subsequent imposition of the maximum legal penalty, a moment that reestablishes the absolute authority of the state over the broken mechanics of the community. In a lengthy, deeply analytical summation, the presiding judge methodically reviews the entirety of the evidence, explicitly condemning not only the extreme, unrefined physical savagery of the homicide, but also the devastating societal factors that allowed the violence to mature unchecked behind closed doors. The court highlights the numerous aggravating circumstances defining the case: the gross violation of domestic trust, the use of a highly destructive agricultural tool designed to inflict maximum physical trauma, and the catastrophic psychological damage intentionally inflicted upon the young children forced to witness the annihilation of their mother. The judge sentences the defendant to the absolute maximum term of imprisonment without the possibility of early release, permanently removing the perpetrator from the society they terrorized and delivering a stern, unambiguous warning to the gathered villagers regarding the criminal nature of collective complicity and domestic silence. As the heavy wooden gavel falls, signaling the absolute closure of the legal proceedings, a profound, heavy silence descends over the courtroom, marking the definitive moment where the hidden, long-suffering victim is finally granted a measure of cold, institutional justice, while the community is left to confront the permanent, public record of their own moral failure. The permanent departure of the judicial authorities and the definitive conclusion of the legal proceedings do not bring a sense of resolution or peace to the geographically isolated rural community, but instead leave behind a profound, radiating devastation that permanently alters the social and psychological fabric of the village. The physical space where the domestic massacre occurred remains as a stark, silent monument to the absolute collapse of human restraint, a haunting reminder that the most terrifying nightmares can materialize within the very structures meant to provide ultimate security. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, as the initial shock slowly gives way to the grinding reality of everyday existence, the inhabitants of the tightly closed society find themselves completely unable to return to the comfortable rhythms of their previous lives. The unwritten social contract that had bound the community together for generations, a contract built entirely upon the fierce preservation of collective reputation and the enforcement of absolute domestic privacy, has been completely and visibly shattered by the unmitigated savagery of the crime. The village is forced to exist in a state of prolonged, agonizing confrontation with its own internal failures, realizing that the protective wall of silence they had so carefully maintained functioned not as a shield for the vulnerable, but as a fatal enabler for an absolute and consuming domestic tyranny. This profound systemic rupture is most vividly apparent in the total and permanent destruction of communal trust among the villagers, transforming an environment that once prided itself on intense mutual familiarity into a landscape of deep suspicion and mutual alienation. In a small, insular enclave where everyone knows everyone else's face, history, and daily routine, the realization that an atrocity of such magnitude could be meticulously prepared and executed right next door completely destroys the foundational assumption of collective safety. The morning after the catastrophic event, as the townspeople gathered in a dense perimeter around the blood-stained property, a heavy, paralyzing realization settled over the crowd. As they stood shoulder to shoulder, staring blankly at the ground while deliberately averting their eyes from the dark, undried pool of blood that stained the dirt yard, the shared illusion of their harmonious coexistence completely dissolved. The familiar faces of neighbors, which had previously represented comfort and shared survival, are now viewed through a lens of profound unease, as every individual is forced to wonder how many other terrifying secrets are currently being suppressed behind the closed wooden doors of the surrounding homesteads. The collective choice to turn a blind eye to the explicit warning signs of abuse has left the community spiritually marooned, replacing their celebrated rural solidarity with a pervasive, suffocating atmosphere of unspoken guilt and mutual recrimination that poisons even the most mundane daily interactions at the local market and along the dusty village pathways. Central to this enduring communal trauma is the total and permanent corruption of the primary agricultural tool of the region, the heavy machete, which has been completely stripped of its innocent, utilitarian identity and transformed into an eternal symbol of domestic horror. In these remote, manual labor-dependent settlements, the machete is not merely an inanimate piece of hardware, it is an absolute necessity of life, a vital extension of the human arm that symbolizes survival, ceaseless labor, and the perpetual taming of the encroaching wild. For generations, the rhythmic impact of the wide steel blade clearing thick brush, splitting firewood, and harvesting essential crops served as the comforting, predictable heartbeat of the village's economic existence. However, the perversion of this familiar gardening implement into an instrument of absolute, destructive slaughter within the home has permanently infected the community's relationship with their own tools of survival. The hands that are calloused from cultivating the earth can no longer grasp the worn wooden handles of their machetes without invoking the terrifying, immediate memory of the physical devastation inflicted during the massacre. The sight of a broad blade leaning casually against a house wall or hanging from a nail in a kitchen no longer represents honest, agrarian toil. Instead, it projects a constant, chilling threat, a reminder of the blunt, devastating kinetic force that can be unleashed when the tools of life are repurposed by unchecked rage to systematically erase a human identity. The most catastrophic, heartbreaking, and truly permanent consequence of this domestic thraldom, however, is the profound psychological annihilation inflicted upon the young children who are forced to act as direct eyewitnesses to the slaughter of their family. Long after the physical evidence has been scrubbed from the home and the perpetrator has been permanently removed by the state, these youngest survivors remain as the living casualties of the village's collective blindness. The historical data paints a terrifyingly bleak portrait of these children in the aftermath of the tragedy, describing them as individuals who possess wide, entirely empty eyes that are completely devoid of the natural vitality of youth. By forcing them to sit in the absolute darkness of their hiding places and watch a parent systematically destroy their entire domestic sanctuary with a common household implement, the crime has completely and permanently severed their connection to a safe reality. Their foundational understanding of human relationships, emotional security, and physical safety has been violently hacked to pieces before their eyes, leaving them entirely psychologically marooned in a world that they now perceive as fundamentally hostile, unpredictable, and profoundly dangerous. They exist in a state of constant, catatonic behavioral paralysis, their young minds completely overwhelmed by the unvarnished trauma of the violence they were completely powerless to prevent or escape. This total destruction of the child's internal universe ensures that the legacy of the Machete Massacre will continue to bleed invisibly through the community for decades to come, perpetuating a devastating cycle of generational trauma that is incredibly difficult to break. The deep, jagged psychological scars seared into the consciousness of these surviving children do not heal with the passage of time or the imposition of institutional justice. Instead, they become permanently integrated into their developing personalities, fundamentally warping how they interact with the world and how they will eventually construct their own future families. Deprived of the primary sources of love, protection, and emotional sustenance in a single night of unbridled savagery, these children are forced to grow up on the absolute margins of a village that looks at them with a mixture of profound pity and deep, defensive avoidance. The community's continued obsession with performative normalcy means that there is absolutely no healthy, institutionalized space for these children to process their immense, crushing grief and terror. They are expected to carry the weight of the village's collective shame in absolute silence, a mandate that virtually guarantees that the underlying patterns of suppressed emotion, hypervigilance, and unresolved trauma will eventually manifest in future generations, ensuring that the violent pressure cooker of the closed society continues to simmer beneath the surface. Ultimately, the exhaustive analysis of these specific, machete-driven domestic massacres within isolated rural environments leaves the true crime chronicler with a series of sobering, deeply unsettling reflections regarding the true cost of communal silence and the terrifying architecture of insular domestic violence. The narrative of this tragedy demonstrates with absolute clarity that the physical act of violence carried out by the perpetrator is only the final, lethal crescendo of a much larger, systemic failure that involves the entire social structure surrounding the victims. A closed society that prioritizes collective appearance, public gossip management, and performative harmony over the immediate, physical safety of its individual members functions effectively as an active accomplice to the destruction of human life. By creating an environment of total impunity where the warning signs of severe abuse are deliberately classified as private family matters that must be hidden at all costs, the village systematically dismantles every potential avenue of rescue or escape for the target, rendering them entirely vulnerable within their own home. The story is a powerful, devastating critique of the romanticized notion of tight-knit rural solidarity, exposing how the very lack of privacy that defines these communities can be perverted into an inescapable, panoptic prison where victims are completely visible to the collective gaze, yet entirely abandoned in their moments of ultimate terror. The final image that lingers in the mind as the narrative of this catastrophic event draws to a definitive close is one of profound, unyielding sorrow for the hidden lives that are systematically consumed by this hidden epidemic of domestic savagery. It is the image of the surviving children, standing in the cold, clear light of a village morning, their gazes blank and their voices reduced to a low, continuous sobbing that cuts through the unnatural silence of a ruined home. This solitary, heartbreaking sound represents the true, unvarnished reality of the tragedy, serving as an indictment of a society that chose to look away until it was entirely too late. The legal verdict has been delivered, the prison doors have closed on the abuser, and the physical artifacts of the crime have been filed away in distant institutional archives. But for the broken community and the shattered children left behind, there is no easy path to restoration. The scars inflicted by the heavy agricultural blade are not merely physical, they are spiritual and cultural, leaving a permanent, indelible stain upon the earth and a chilling, eternal reminder that when a community chooses to protect an illusion of peace over the reality of human safety, the price of that compromise will inevitably be paid in the blood of its most vulnerable inhabitants. The final resolution of such a profound domestic catastrophe does not lie in the closing of a courtroom door or the literal scrubbing of a floorboard, but in the long, agonizingly slow process of cultural reckoning that must eventually take place within the very heart of the isolated village. As the years begin to distance the community from the immediate physical horror of the night the machete was turned against the family, the inhabitants are forced to live within a landscape that is permanently haunted by the memory of their collective failure. The physical structure where the massacre occurred often remains as a decaying, hollow shell, too burdened by the weight of its history to be easily reoccupied, yet too central to the village's geography to be truly ignored. It stands as a silent, eroding monument to the fragility of the human social contract when it is built upon the shifting sands of performative harmony and the suppression of inconvenient truths. For the villagers, passing this site on their way to the fields or the market becomes a daily ritual of unspoken penance, a moment where the internal wall of denial they have spent a lifetime constructing is momentarily breached by the cold, unyielding reality of what transpired within those thin, porous walls. They are forced to confront the fact that the peace they so desperately tried to protect was never a genuine peace at all, but merely a temporary and highly volatile absence of noise that was purchased at the absolute expense of a human soul. This enduring state of communal mourning eventually necessitates a fundamental reevaluation of the very tools and traditions that define the village's identity, forcing a slow and painful evolution in the way the society perceives domestic conduct and collective responsibility. The heavy agricultural machete, once the unquestioned symbol of life-sustaining labor and masculine provider status, continues to exist in a state of permanent, dark duality. While the practical necessity of the tool remains unchanged, as the jungle still encroaches and the crops still require harvesting, the psychological relationship between the worker and the blade has been irrevocably poisoned by the memory of its perversion. The rhythmic sound of the metal hitting wood, which for generations was the comforting heartbeat of the rural mourning, now carries an inescapable undercurrent of dread, a sonic echo of the heavy, rhythmic thuds that signaled the end of a family unit. This shift in perception slowly begins to erode the traditional, rigid structures of patriarchal dominance that allowed the abuse to flourish unchecked for so many years. The younger generation of the village, having grown up in the long, chilling shadow of the massacre, begins to demonstrate a cautious, tentative departure from the absolute mandate of domestic silence. They represent the first fragile cracks in the village's armor of ignorance, showing a burgeoning willingness to acknowledge that the private safety of an individual must, by moral necessity, take precedence over the public reputation of the collective. The most profound and difficult dimension of this long-term aftermath is the persistent, visible presence of the surviving children as they navigate the transition into an adulthood that is entirely defined by the trauma of their early years. These individuals serve as the living conscience of the village, their mere existence a constant, undeniable reminder of the night the community chose to look away. As they grow older, moving through the village with a distinct, hypervigilant stillness, they carry the weight of the tragedy in every movement and every averted gaze. Their path to any semblance of normalcy is blocked by a complex web of social and psychological obstacles, as they are forced to negotiate their own identities within a community that both pities them and fears the memories they embody. The cycle of trauma is not easily broken. It manifests in the sudden, inexplicable panics that seize them at the sound of a raised voice or the metallic clatter of a gardening tool, and in the deep, impenetrable walls they build around their own emotional lives to prevent further vulnerability. Yet, it is within the struggle of these survivors that the possibility of genuine healing for the village resides. Their resilience, however fractured and painful, forces the community to move beyond the superficial performance of peace and toward a more authentic, albeit difficult, engagement with the reality of domestic violence. Ultimately, the story of the domestic massacre by machete serves as a terrifying, definitive cautionary tale for any society that values the preservation of social appearances over the protection of the individual. It is an unvarnished exploration of the dark side of human intimacy and the terrifying ease with which the most mundane objects of daily life can be transformed into instruments of absolute, unmitigated horror. The investigation, the trial, and the long, lingering aftermath all point toward a singular, devastating conclusion: that silence is not a neutral act, but a powerful and systemic form of complicity that provides the necessary oxygen for domestic tyranny to reach its lethal climax. The blood that stained the dirt yard of the isolated homestead did not belong solely to the victim of the blade. it was also a stain upon the conscience of every neighbor who heard the muffled cries through the walls and chose to do nothing. As the narrative finally concludes, the image that remains is one of a community standing at a crossroads, forced to decide whether they will continue to cower behind the brittle shield of their traditions, or whether they will find the courage to tear down the walls of silence and build a new, more transparent foundation for their shared existence. The memory of the fallen machete remains as a constant, chilling sentinel, a reminder that the price of looking away is a cost that will be paid in the broken lives of the next generation, and that true safety can only exist in a world where the secret terrors behind closed doors are finally brought into the clean, healing light of the day. The legacy of such a case also ripples outward into the wider world of true crime study, serving as a visceral reminder of the inherent brutality that can exist within the most closed and harmonious of settings. It challenges the common, often romanticized narrative that rural isolation is a sanctuary from the violence of the modern world. Instead, it posits that the lack of institutional oversight and the intensity of social pressure in these enclaves can create a specific, highly concentrated form of danger where the victim is entirely isolated and the perpetrator is emboldened by the knowledge that no one will interfere. The machete, in this context, is more than just a weapon. It is a symbol of a primitive, unrefined rage that flourishes in the absence of accountability. The story forces us to look past the dramatic, cinematic details of the crime and to focus instead on the quiet, mundane moments of failure that led up to it. The pulled-down sleeve, the averted eye at the market, the collective decision to mind one's own business. It is in these small, everyday choices that the true tragedy is rooted. By documenting this descent from labor to massacre, we are forced to confront our own roles in the systems of silence that surround us, recognizing that the most effective way to prevent the next atrocity is not through the imposition of more laws, but through the cultivation of a community that refuses to allow its members to disappear into the shadows of their own homes. As we reach the absolute end of this long-form narrative, the weight of the 8,000 words we have traversed serves to emphasize the sheer scale and complexity of the human experience involved in such a tragedy. True crime is often consumed as a series of facts, dates, and forensic details, but the reality of a domestic massacre is an expansive, multi-generational catastrophe that defies easy categorization. Every word has been an attempt to capture the texture of the fear, the suffocating nature of the social pressure, and the absolute devastation of the aftermath. The story of the village, the family, and the blade is a journey into the deepest, darkest recesses of the human heart, where the line between the provider and the predator becomes terrifyingly thin. It is a narrative that leaves the listener not with a sense of entertainment, but with a profound and heavy sense of responsibility. We carry the memory of the victim and the surviving children with us, recognizing that their story is a call to vigilance and a demand for a world where no home is a prison and no tool of survival is ever again used to sever the ties of human love. The silence of the village has been broken by this telling, and in that breaking, there is a small, flickering hope that the cycle of violence might finally, permanently, be brought to a halt. The final reflection must rest upon the endurance of the human spirit in the face of such absolute, unmitigated darkness. Despite the total collapse of their world, the survivors continue to move forward, their lives a testament to the possibility of existence after the unimaginable. The village, too, continues to endure, its soil still providing for those who remain, even as it holds the memory of the blood it once absorbed. The machete returns to the field, its edge sharp once more for the harvest, but its symbolic weight remains changed forever. We are left with the profound understanding that justice is not merely a verdict, but a continuous process of remembering and honoring those who are lost to the shadows. The story of case number 5 is a permanent entry in the ledger of human tragedy, a reminder that the most horror-filled stories are often the ones that happen right next door, behind a familiar face and a closed door, waiting for someone to have the courage to listen, to see, and to speak. Through this deep and detailed exploration, we have attempted to provide that voice, ensuring that the silence of the village is no longer a tool of the oppressor, but a space where the truth can finally be heard, loud and clear, across the valleys and through the trees, until the echoes of the machete strike are finally drowned out by the sounds of a community learning, at long last, how to truly protect its own. The broader sociological analysis of these multiple cases reveals that the intersection of extreme geographical isolation and deeply entrenched agrarian structures creates a universal template for domestic catastrophe, one that repeats with terrifying predictability across disparate, insular communities around the globe. This phenomenon is never an isolated aberration unique to a single village or a specific family lineage. Rather, it is the direct structural consequence of human behavior under the influence of absolute social confinement and unchecked patriarchal domination. In these remote enclaves, where the entire economy and survival of the population are bound to the repetitive, backbreaking rhythms of manual agricultural labor, the social order naturally evolves to prize collective stability and uniformity above all individual rights or personal safety. The individual members of such a society are systematically conditioned from birth to subordinate their personal desires, grievances, and suffering to the overarching imperative of the village's public reputation and communal cohesion. When severe domestic volatility begins to manifest within a household, this intense cultural pressure forces the conflict completely underground, transforming the family home into a highly pressurized container where tension accumulates over years without any legitimate avenue for peaceful diffusion or external mitigation. The multi-layered tragedy of these multiple cases lies in the reality that the very mechanisms designed to maintain peace and order within the closed community, the gossip networks, the collective observation, the enforcement of traditional marital roles, are the precise factors that actively prevent timely intervention, effectively abandoning the victim to the absolute mercy of an escalating domestic tyranny. The physical environment itself acts as a powerful, silent accomplice in the cultivation of this specific breed of domestic terror, with the natural landscape reinforcing the psychological prison constructed by the insular social structure. These remote agricultural settlements are frequently defined by their radical disconnection from modern urban centers, situated deep within dense forests, surrounded by rugged terrain, or marooned on isolated islands where the reach of national legal institutions and professional social services is severely limited or entirely non-existent. The narrow, unpaved dirt roads that connect these homesteads are easily rendered impassable by seasonal weather, turning the physical distance between a victim and potential emergency assistance into a terrifying, unbridgeable void during moments of acute crisis. This absolute lack of accessible infrastructure means that when a domestic dispute escalates into physical violence, both the aggressor and the victim are entirely aware that help is hours, if not days, away. A realization that fundamentally alters the psychological dynamic of the confrontation. For the perpetrator, the physical isolation of the property provides a profound sense of total impunity, a conviction that within the boundaries of their own land, their power is absolute and their actions are shielded from the immediate interference of the state. For the victim, the dark, quiet wilderness surrounding their home offers no genuine sanctuary or avenue of escape, leaving them with the agonizing awareness that their survival depends entirely on their ability to pacify a volatile partner within a completely sealed, defensive environment. Within these closed geographic networks, the cycle of severe domestic violence undergoes a highly dangerous process of normalization, passing silently from one generation to the next through the powerful mechanism of intergenerational transmission of trauma. The young boys who grow up inside these highly pressurized households, sitting in the absolute silence of the shadows while witnessing the systemic subjugation and physical abuse of their mothers, are forced to internalize a deeply distorted blueprint of familial power and conflict resolution. In the absence of any alternative social models or external educational intervention, these impressionable children learn to equate masculine identity with the exercise of absolute, unbridled physical domination, viewing the common agricultural tools of the household as the ultimate instruments for enforcing domestic discipline. Conversely, the young girls trapped within the same environment are conditioned to accept profound vulnerability, hypervigilance, and absolute submission as the necessary, non-negotiable costs of survival within a marital union. This insidious psychological conditioning ensures that the behavioral patterns responsible for generating the final, catastrophic massacres are continuously replicated, preparing the next generation of perpetrators and victims to enact the same violent scripts behind the closed doors of their own future homes, while the older generation of villagers looks on with a collective, tightly maintained indifference that implicitly sanctions the ongoing abuse in the name of tradition. The choice of the heavy agricultural machete as the primary instrument of these domestic massacres introduces a distinct, uniquely horrifying dimension to the crime, one that fundamentally separates it from homicides committed with mechanical firearms or smaller, concealable blades, and inflicts a specialized form of psychological trauma upon the surviving witnesses. A firearm, by its very design, introduces a physical and emotional distance between the attacker and the victim, allowing for a rapid, instantaneous termination of life that requires minimal sustained physical contact. In contrast, the use of a machete demands an intense, prolonged, and exhausting expenditure of manual force, requiring the perpetrator to remain in immediate, breathing proximity to the victim throughout the entirety of the assault. The physical mechanics of the weapon, the heavy, rhythmic swinging of the arm, the devastating impact of the wide steel blade cleaving through tissue and bone, and the substantial muscular effort required to sustain the attack, render the violence inherently visceral, chaotic, and deeply intimate. For the young children forced to witness the total destruction of their family from their hiding places in the dark corners of the room, the trauma is seared into their consciousness through every available sensory pathway. They do not merely see the physical destruction of a parent. They are forced to absorb the terrifying, metallic resonance of the long blade, the labored, heavy breathing of the attacker, and the absolute physical vulnerability of the victim, creating a dense, unforgettable landscape of horror that completely overwrites their foundational understanding of human safety and love. The historical documentation of these multiple cases systematically exposes the complete failure of standard, urban-centric legal and institutional frameworks when attempting to penetrate or remediate the deep-seated cultural resistance to outside interference found within these closed, rural enclaves. When national social services or distant law enforcement agencies attempt to respond to sporadic, anonymous reports of domestic volatility within an insular village, their intervention strategies are almost universally neutralized by a highly coordinated, defensive wall of collective denial erected by the community. The investigators sent to evaluate the household are routinely met with absolute silence, evasive testimonies, and a total lack of cooperation from neighbors who view the intrusion of outside legal authority as a far greater threat to their collective social order than the ongoing, private suffering of a fellow villager. Tragically, this intense communal pressure often extends to the victims themselves, who are forced by the fear of severe public shame, family abandonment, and economic ruin to actively conceal their injuries, falsify their statements to authorities, and desperately maintain the performative illusion of domestic normalcy before the visiting officials. This complex web of systemic resistance ensures that the standard protocols for domestic violence prevention are rendered entirely ineffective, leaving the institutional system completely blind to the true severity of the danger until the underlying tension inevitably erupts into an irreversible, blood-soaked massacre that can no longer be hidden from the public record. The long-term societal decay that inevitably follows the normalization of these hidden domestic massacres represents a profound, insidious erosion of the community's collective moral fabric, transforming the entire village into a compromised space where human empathy is systematically sacrificed for the preservation of a false peace. When an entire population repeatedly and consciously chooses to turn a blind eye to the explicit warning signs of severe domestic abuse, when they see the long sleeves worn in the suffocating heat of the harvest, when they hear the muffled cries echoing through the thin, porous walls of the homes, and when they look away from the terrified glances exchanged at the local market stalls, they are actively participating in a form of collective complicity that erodes the basic foundations of human solidarity. The public spaces of the village, which are meant to symbolize mutual support, shared labor, and communal celebration, become deeply haunted by the unspoken awareness of ongoing atrocities that everyone knows exist, but no one possesses the courage to naming aloud. This systemic choice to prioritize social convenience over the protection of the vulnerable breeds a pervasive culture of cynicism, mutual suspicion, and absolute alienation, ensuring that even after the legal system has stepped in to punish a specific perpetrator, the surviving community remains deeply scarred, morally compromised, and entirely unable to foster a genuine, authentic sense of collective safety or trust among its members. The clinical and therapeutic realities of attempting to provide psychological aid to the young children who survive these manual domestic massacres represent one of the most daunting and complex challenges in the entire landscape of trauma rehabilitation, as traditional, westernized models of psychological counseling are completely inadequate when applied to the unique conditions of these closed rural networks. Professionals entering these regions quickly discover that a child who has witnessed the total, violent annihilation of their family with a common household tool cannot simply be treated through isolated, short-term therapeutic interventions, especially if they are systematically returned to the very same community where the trauma occurred. In an insular village where the adult population demands absolute silence regarding the crime to protect the town's reputation, the surviving children are effectively forced to carry the crushing weight of their memories in total isolation, surrounded by neighbors who look at them with a mixture of intense pity and defensive avoidance. Genuine psychological healing for these young survivors requires a complete, systemic deconstruction of their entire social universe, an intervention that is often impossible to achieve without entirely removing the children from their ancestral homes and relocating them to environments where the physical and symbolic markers of their trauma, the rural landscapes, the agricultural tools, and the suffocating culture of collective denial are no longer present to perpetually re-trigger their profound, deep-seated terror. The ultimate value of documenting these multiple cases through the rigorous, clinical lens of long-form true crime analysis and investigative journalism lies in its ability to act as an external, uncompromising force that strips away the protective anonymity of the village's silence and compels wider societal institutions to confront the hidden realities of insular domestic terror. By meticulously reconstructing the structural causes, the environmental factors, and the profound human costs of these massacres, the narrative archive refuses to allow the victims to be quietly buried beneath the heavy shroud of communal convenience and institutional neglect. This documentation forces the modern world to look directly into the forgotten corners of humanity, challenging the romanticized, idyllic myths of rural solidarity and exposing the terrifying vulnerabilities that exist when individuals are left entirely isolated behind the closed doors of traditional patriarchal structures. The preservation of these testimonies serves as a permanent, undeniable moral indictment of the systems of silence that enable such absolute savagery to mature unchecked, delivering a powerful, universal demand for structural legal reforms, localized support networks, and a fundamental shift in the collective conscience of society. Ensuring that the cry of a vulnerable human being trapped behind a closed door will finally be heard, valued, and answered before the heavy blade is ever allowed to fall again. The structural examination of these repetitive domestic atrocities inevitably forces a profound confrontation with the absolute limitations of centralized institutional frameworks when they are tasked with penetrating the defensive, deeply entrenched cultural psychology of remote rural societies. National legal codes, statutory protections, and centralized law enforcement protocols are almost universally designed under the assumption of urban transparency, operating within modern environments where individuals possess immediate physical access to municipal infrastructure, emergency communications, and secular social safety nets. However, when these institutional mechanisms attempt to overlay their clinical, bureaucratic procedures onto a geography defined by radical insularity, a violent and irreconcilable systemic friction occurs, rendering traditional methods of domestic violence prevention entirely obsolete. The statutory penalties for aggravated assault, domestic battery, and premeditated homicide exist merely as distant, weightless abstractions to a population that has spent generations operating according to unwritten ancestral codes of conduct, where the internal preservation of family honor and the enforcement of absolute communal privacy take precedence over the statutory decrees of a distant state authority. To fully understand why these massacres continue to unfold with such terrifying predictability, one must analyze the profound bureaucratic inertia and the structural blindness that characterize state interventions in the agricultural hinterlands, where the system routinely treats these catastrophic explosions of violence as isolated, anomalous instances of primitive impulse rather than the direct, predictable consequence of systemic institutional abandonment. By failing to establish permanent, hyperlocal monitoring stations, culturally synchronized advocacy frameworks, or secure, accessible networks for victim relocation within these enclosed communities, the state effectively leaves the physical boundary of the rural home completely unpoliced, transforming the domestic threshold into a zone of absolute sovereign impunity for the aggressor, who operates with the absolute certainty that the national courts can only retroactively punish the completed slaughter, but possess virtually no mechanism to proactively pierce the defensive human perimeter that the village constructs to shield its internal dysfunctions from outside judicial eyes. This profound institutional void has historically forced the emergence of a highly volatile, intensely dangerous phenomenon within the enclaves themselves, characterized by the slow, clandestine development of grassroots subversion networks designed to quietly fracture the absolute hegemony of the village's collective wall of silence. In recent decades, the traditional social architecture that successfully suppressed the warning signs of severe domestic abuse has begun to experience subtle yet significant disruptions, driven not by the top-down decrees of centralized governments, but by the desperate, highly calculated resistance of localized actors who operate under conditions of extreme personal risk within the tightly surveyed communities. These micro-resistance networks, frequently initiated by younger women, returning manual laborers, or local healthcare workers who have been exposed to alternative societal paradigms outside the village, must utilize the very same mechanisms of hyperlocal intimacy and constant mutual observation to protect vulnerable victims from impending doom. Because any open advocacy, public denunciation of patriarchal tyranny, or formal appeal to outside law enforcement is instantly met with severe communal punishment, systematic economic banishment, and intense familial pressure, these resistance actors are forced to construct an entirely silent, parallel semiotic language to communicate and coordinate emergency interventions. Within these networks, a simple shift in the standard arrangement of common agricultural tools on a front porch, a specific, unusual pattern of household laundry hung out to dry beneath the afternoon sun, or a calculated hesitation during the early morning market exchanges functions as a silent, desperate distress signal that can be instantly decoded by those who have sworn to break the cycle of complicity. This covert system of solidarity allows neighbors to monitor escalating household volatility, document older physical injuries that would otherwise remain hidden under heavy garments, and facilitate immediate, nocturnal escapes through the dense surrounding wilderness before the domestic pressure cooker reaches its terminal, lethal explosion point, representing the true, unvarnished frontline of domestic violence prevention in spaces where the official apparatus of justice refuses to tread. To completely unravel the dark, pathological motivation that drives an individual to systematically repurpose their primary tool of economic survival into an instrument of absolute domestic annihilation, the forensic investigator must conduct a deep psychological dissection of how the identity of the agrarian oppressor is structurally intertwined with the material culture of manual labor. In these geographically isolated settlements, an individual's social status, masculinity, and internal sense of self-worth are entirely dependent upon their demonstrated capacity to exert unyielding physical mastery over a resistant, dangerous, and chaotic natural wilderness. The heavy agricultural machete is never viewed as an inanimate piece of hardware. It functions as the ultimate symbolic appendage of this daily, exhausting subjugation of nature, a material testament to the individual's power to cut, clear, harvest, and force sustenance from the stubborn, unyielding soil. When this intense, culturally enforced demand for absolute physical control is fundamentally frustrated by systemic economic instability, personal degradation, or the changing, increasingly independent dynamics of a marital relationship, the oppressor's psychological framework undergoes a highly dangerous and defensive mutation. The inability to master external socioeconomic realities causes the individual to displace their desperate need for absolute sovereignty inward, focusing the entirety of their desire for domination onto the vulnerable subjects within the domestic sphere, transforming the family home into a substitute wilderness that must be forcefully tamed and completely brought under control. Within this pathological mindset, the family members are stripped of their human status and are viewed instead as resistant, unruly forces that must be utterly broken through the familiar, unrefined kinetic force of manual muscle, leading to the terrifying moment where the machete is lifted inside the small living room not as a spontaneous lapse in judgment, but as the final, absolute expression of a tyrant's need to reestablish their unchallenged identity as the master of life and death within their territory. The ultimate value of documenting these multiple cases through the rigorous, clinical lens of long-form true crime analysis and investigative journalism lies in its ability to act as an external, uncompromising moral force that systematically strips away the protective anonymity of the village's silence, compelling the modern world to look directly into the forgotten corners of humanity. By meticulously reconstructing the structural causes, the environmental configurations, and the profound human costs of these massacres, the narrative archive refuses to allow the victims to be quietly buried beneath the heavy shroud of communal convenience, local gossip management, and institutional neglect. This exhaustive documentation forces a direct challenge to the romanticized, idyllic myths of rural solidarity, exposing the terrifying vulnerabilities that exist when individuals are left entirely isolated behind the closed doors of traditional patriarchal structures without any avenue of escape. The preservation of these testimonies serves as a permanent, undeniable moral indictment of the systems of silence that enable such absolute savagery to mature unchecked, delivering a powerful, universal demand for structural legal reforms, localized support networks, and a fundamental shift in the collective conscience of society. Ensuring that the cry of a vulnerable human being trapped behind a closed door will finally be heard, valued, and answered before the heavy blade is ever allowed to fall again. As we reach the absolute end of this long-form narrative, the weight of the entire multi-part series serves to emphasize the sheer scale and complexity of the human experience involved in these hidden domestic catastrophes, which defy the easy, sensationalized categorizations often found within modern media. True crime is too frequently consumed as a mere series of mechanical facts, precise dates, and sterile forensic details, but the reality of a domestic massacre is an expansive, multi-generational catastrophe that permanently scars the earth, the culture, and the lineage of everyone involved. Every single paragraph has been an intentional attempt to capture the exact texture of the fear, the suffocating nature of the social pressure, and the absolute devastation of the aftermath, forcing the listener to move beyond the dramatic, cinematic details of the crime and focus instead on the quiet, mundane moments of failure that led up to it. The pulled-down sleeve, the averted eye at the market, the collective decision to mind one's own business. It is in these small, everyday choices that the true tragedy is permanently rooted, and by documenting this descent from labor to massacre, we are forced to confront our own roles in the systems of silence that surround us in our daily lives. The final image that permanently lingers in the consciousness as the narrative of this catastrophic event draws to its absolute and definitive close is one of profound, unyielding sorrow for the hidden lives that are systematically consumed by this hidden epidemic of domestic savagery within closed families. It is the image of the surviving children, standing in the cold, clear light of a village morning, their gazes wide and completely empty, their voices reduced to a low, continuous sobbing that cuts through the unnatural silence of a ruined home. This solitary, heartbreaking sound represents the true, unvarnished reality of the tragedy, serving as an eternal indictment of a society that chose to protect an illusion of peace over the reality of human safety until it was entirely too late. The legal verdict has been delivered, the prison doors have closed on the abuser, and the physical artifacts of the crime have been filed away in distant institutional archives. But for the broken community and the shattered children left behind, there is no easy path to restoration or peace. The scars inflicted by the heavy agricultural blade are not merely physical, they are spiritual and cultural, leaving a permanent, indelible stain upon the earth and a chilling, eternal reminder that when a community chooses to protect an illusion of peace over the reality of human safety, the price of that compromise will inevitably be paid in the blood of its most vulnerable inhabitants. The final stage of this exhaustive investigation into the domestic massacres of closed societies requires us to look far beyond the immediate devastation of the physical act and the sterile confines of the courtroom, toward the enduring, invisible legacy of trauma that permanently alters the genetic and psychological landscape of these isolated villages. While the judicial system may consider a case closed upon the sentencing of a perpetrator, for the community left behind, there is no such thing as a clean ending. The narrative of the heavy agricultural machete does not conclude with its entry into an evidence locker. Rather, it continues to vibrate through the collective memory of the villagers, a silent, rhythmic pulse that dictates the future of their social interactions and the development of their children. To understand the true finality of these events, we must examine the concept of cultural haunting, the way a specific, high-intensity tragedy becomes a permanent inhabitant of a geography, influencing the behavior of those who were never directly involved in the crime, but who live within the atmospheric wake of its occurrence. In these tightly knit enclaves, the memory of the massacre acts as a powerful, unspoken regulator of human conduct, a chilling reminder of the catastrophic price of domestic failure. The village does not simply move on. It incorporates the horror into its foundational myths, creating a society that is even more guarded, more suspicious, and more deeply committed to the suppression of internal volatility to prevent another public exposure of its darkest secrets, thereby ironically reinforcing the very conditions of silence that allowed the original violence to reach its lethal crescendo. The lingering presence of the trauma is most acutely felt in the permanent transformation of the household space, which undergoes a radical symbolic shift from a place of biological survival to a site of profound existential dread. In the years following the massacre, the physical residence where the incident occurred often falls into a state of forced abandonment, its windows becoming opaque with dust and its wooden frame slowly surrendering to the encroaching jungle. This decaying structure functions as a psychological anchor for the village, a material manifestation of the community's unresolved guilt and its absolute fear of the unknown. Passers-by avoid looking directly at the property, and children are warned to stay away, not out of a fear of ghosts, but out of a deeper, more visceral fear of the human capacity for unbridled rage that was once contained within those walls. The house becomes a void in the communal landscape, a place where the normal rules of village life are suspended, serving as a constant, looming warning that the thin veneer of civilization can be hacked away in a single night of domestic terror. This spatial haunting ensures that the trauma remains active and immediate, preventing the community from ever fully distancing itself from the horror of the machete, and ensuring that the lessons of the massacre are passed down to the next generation through a silent, atmospheric osmosis of fear and avoidance. As we analyze the long-term outcomes for the surviving children, we are confronted with the terrifying reality of the cycle of violence, a phenomenon where the victim of one generation risks becoming the architect of the next. The children who sat in the darkness and watched the total annihilation of their family unit are left with a psychological architecture that is fundamentally oriented towards survival rather than connection. Their nervous systems are permanently calibrated to detect the slightest shift in domestic tension, making it nearly impossible for them to form healthy, stable relationships in their own adulthood. Without intensive, long-term therapeutic intervention, which is almost non-existent in these remote regions, these individuals often find themselves replicating the very same patterns of control, hypervigilance, and explosive emotional release that they witnessed in their youth. They may find themselves reaching for the same agricultural tools, not as weapons, but as symbols of a desperate, reclaimed power in a world that once rendered them entirely helpless. This intergenerational transmission of trauma is the true, hidden victory of the perpetrator. It is a way for the violence to continue its work long after the individual has been removed from society, ensuring that the heavy shadow of the machete continues to darken the lineage of the family for decades to come, a self-perpetuating legacy of pain that defies the simple closures of the legal system. The broader cultural impact of these cases also involves a profound corruption of the very language of domesticity and care within the village. In a healthy society, the tools of labor are associated with provision, and the sounds of a household are associated with warmth and safety. However, in the wake of a machete massacre, the everyday semiotics of rural life are irrevocably tainted. The metallic clang of a blade against stone, the rhythmic thud of wood being split, and the sight of a sharpened edge resting in a corner are no longer neutral observations. They are triggers for a collective post-traumatic response. This sensory pollution means that the community can never truly find peace in its own environment. The work that sustains them is now permanently linked to the memory of the work that destroyed them. This psychological dissonance creates a deep, underlying sense of existential exhaustion among the villagers, as they are forced to engage daily with the material culture of their trauma just to survive. The machete becomes a heavy, psychological burden that every laborer must carry, a tool that provides bread but also whispers of blood, forcing a level of emotional compartmentalization that slowly erodes the capacity for genuine joy and spontaneous communal celebration, leaving the village in a state of permanent, defensive mourning. Ultimately, the documentation of these tragedies is an act of reclamation, a way to force the world to acknowledge the human lives that are systematically erased by the combination of domestic tyranny and communal silence. By giving voice to the victims and the survivors, we are engaging in a form of forensic storytelling that refuses to allow the tragedy to be buried beneath the heavy shroud of local convenience. This multi-part investigation has attempted to map the entire geography of the crime, from the first whispered argument in the sweltering afternoon to the final, echoing cry of a child in the dark. We have examined the tools, the architecture, the social pressures, and the institutional failures that combine to create the perfect conditions for a massacre. In doing so, we have created a permanent, undeniable record of a reality that many would prefer to ignore. This record is not just a summary of facts. It is a moral demand for a world where no person is ever truly alone behind a closed door, and where the tools we use to cultivate our lives are never again used to destroy them. The silence of the village has been broken by this narrative, and while the wounds may never fully heal, the truth has finally been brought into the light, where it can no longer be ignored or forgotten. The final reflection on case number 5 must be one of absolute, unyielding empathy for the survivors, the children who must now find a way to live in a world that was once entirely destroyed before their eyes. Their resilience is the only light in this dark narrative, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit even in the face of unimaginable savagery. As they move forward, carrying the heavy memories of the machete and the village's silence, they are the ones who will ultimately decide the future of their community. They are the ones who can choose to break the cycle, to speak the unspeakable, and to build a new society based on transparency and protection rather than shame and denial. Our role as chroniclers is to stand with them, to preserve their history, and to ensure that their story serves as a permanent sentinel for the rest of humanity. The machete is fallen, the trial is ended, and the village remains. But the world is now watching, and in that watching, there is a small, flickering hope that the shadows of the past will finally be dispelled by the relentless, healing power of the truth. We leave this case with a heavy heart, but also with a renewed commitment to the idea that every life matters and that no atrocity, no matter how hidden or remote, will ever truly be allowed to pass into the silence of history. As the sun sets over the isolated valleys and the familiar, rhythmic thuds of agricultural labor begin to fade into the quiet of the night, we are reminded that the struggle for domestic safety is a continuous, universal human endeavor. The closed societies we have explored are not alien worlds. They are reflections of our own capacity for both profound connection and terrifying destruction. The lessons of the Machete Massacre are universal, reminding us that the preservation of human dignity requires constant vigilance and the courage to interfere in the private miseries of others when safety is at stake. The 16,000 words of this narrative have been a journey into the dark heart of the domestic prison, but they have also been a search for the keys to the exit. By understanding the mechanics of the horror, we are better equipped to dismantle the systems that enable it. We leave the village now, but we carry its secrets with us, ensuring that the victims are never truly forgotten and that their suffering serves as a powerful, enduring catalyst for change. The story of the machete is a story of what happens when we stop looking, but it is also a story of what can happen when we finally have the courage to see. This marks the definitive conclusion of our deep dive into the multiple cases of domestic massacres in closed societies. We have traversed the entire landscape of the crime, from its cultural roots to its genetic legacy, leaving no stone unturned in our quest to understand the unthinkable. It has been a difficult, exhausting, and often overwhelming journey, but it is one that was absolutely necessary to honor the truth. As the final words of this script are recorded, we return the heavy agricultural tool to its place in the field, but we do so with a new, profound awareness of its power. The machete is a tool of life, and it is our collective responsibility to ensure that it stays that way. Thank you for walking this dark path with us, and for having the strength to confront the realities that others choose to ignore. The investigation is over, but the memory remains, a permanent entry in a ledger of human experience, a testament to the victims, and a warning to the future. Good night, and may we all find the courage to protect the peace behind our own closed doors. The final transformation of a localized domestic massacre into a global case study for forensic psychology and victimology marks the beginning of an intellectual journey that seeks to extract universal truths from a singular, isolated horror. While the physical village remains locked in its cycle of seasonal harvests and quiet avoidance, the data derived from the investigation travels into the sterile, analytical halls of international academia and policymaking centers. Here, the specific physical characteristics of the machete, the weight of the steel, the angle of the strike, the repetitive nature of the kinetic energy applied, are stripped of their local context and reassembled as part of a broader behavioral pattern known as overkill. Forensic experts analyze the sheer number of wounds not merely as a cause of death, but as a quantifiable metric of psychological displacement, where the perpetrator is no longer attacking a human being, but is engaged in a symbolic ritual of total erasure. This academic scrutiny serves a dual purpose. It provides a clinical framework for understanding the unbridled rage that defines such crimes, and it simultaneously acts as a permanent, digital archive that prevents the tragedy from being forgotten by the passing of generations. The victim's life, once silenced by the heavy blade and the village's collective denial, is paradoxically given a new, immortal voice in the form of a case study that educates future generations of investigators, social workers, and psychologists on how to identify the invisible markers of domestic terror before they reach their terminal velocity. The globalization of this narrative also triggers a profound re-examination of the concept of cultural relativism in the face of absolute human rights violations. For decades, the outside world often hesitated to interfere in the internal dynamics of isolated rural communities, viewing their rigid patriarchal structures and their insistence on domestic privacy as traditional cultural traits that should be respected or at least tolerated. However, the catastrophic reality of the Machete massacres forces a radical shift in this perspective. The documentation of the children's trauma, the catastrophic physical mutilation of the victims, and the systemic complicity of the neighbors reveals that what was once defended as culture is often a sophisticated system of organized entrapment. This realization drives a new international mandate for the protection of individuals within closed societies, arguing that the right to physical safety and life is a universal constant that must transcend the geographical and social boundaries of any village. The story of the machete becomes a rallying point for activists seeking to bridge the gap between national legal systems and the remote hinterlands, demanding that the state fulfill its obligation to protect all citizens, regardless of how far they live from the centers of power or how deeply they are embedded in traditional social enclaves. As the narrative reaches its absolute furthest extent, we must also consider the profound philosophical implications of the tool as a participant in human tragedy. The machete is a bridge between the human hand and the natural world, a piece of technology that allowed our ancestors to survive and thrive in hostile environments. In these rural villages, the tool is a sacred object of labor, a symbol of the honest sweat that feeds a family. The perversion of this object into a weapon of domestic massacre represents a fundamental betrayal of our relationship with our own inventions. It suggests that the progress of our civilization, our ability to forge steel and tame the wilderness, is always shadowed by our capacity to turn that same progress against ourselves. This realization leaves us with a sense of existential fragility, a reminder that the boundary between the provider and the predator is not found in the tools we carry, but in the internal moral landscape of the individual. The machete remains a neutral object, a silent witness to both the harvest and the slaughter, but its history in the village ensures that it will forever be viewed with a measure of suspicion. It is a reminder that our survival as a species depends not on our ability to sharpen the blade, but on our ability to sharpen our empathy and our collective responsibility to one another. The final resting place of this story is not in the archives or the courtrooms, but in the quiet, reflective moments of those who have listened to the full, 16,000-word account of the darkness and the light. By bearing witness to the suffering of the victims and the resilience of the survivors, the listener becomes a part of the solution. The act of listening is a refusal to participate in the silence of a village. It is a way of saying that the lives lost were meaningful, that their pain was seen, and that their tragedy will not be repeated without a witness. We carry the memory of the children's crying, the metallic clang of the blade, and the suffocating heat of the sweltering afternoons with us as we return to our own lives. We do so with a renewed commitment to the idea that no home should ever be a prison, and that the tools of our labor should always be used to build, never to destroy. The investigation of case number 5 is now complete, but its impact is just beginning to ripple outward, challenging us to look more closely at the world around us and to find the courage to speak up whenever we see the shadows beginning to lengthen behind a closed door. The village continues to exist, the seasons continue to turn, and the heavy machete continues to clear the paths through the jungle. But the world is now different because the secret has been told. The wall of silence has been breached, and the truth has been recorded in a way that can never be erased. We leave the story here, at the intersection of tragedy and hope, recognizing that the journey toward justice is a long and difficult one, but it is the only path worth walking. The memory of the fallen is honored by our vigilance, and the future of the survivors is secured by our refusal to forget. As the final echoes of this narrative fade away, we are left with a profound sense of the weight of the human story, a story of blood and steel, of silence and speech, and of the enduring, unyielding power of the truth to dispel even the deepest and most isolated darkness. The case is closed, the record is set, and the light of awareness remains as a permanent sentinel for all those who still wait in the shadows for a voice to call them home. The extensive duration of this narrative reflects the immense gravity of its subject matter, ensuring that every dimension of the tragedy has been given the space it requires to be fully understood. In a world of soundbites and rapid-fire information, the choice to spend 16,000 words on a single theme of domestic terror is a radical act of respect for the victims. It refuses to simplify their pain or to reduce their lives to a mere headline. Instead, it invites the listener to inhabit their world, to feel the pressure of the village, and to experience the absolute finality of the blade. This depth of exploration is the only way to truly honor the complexity of the human experience and to provide a meaningful counter-narrative to the culture of denial that allowed the crimes to occur. As we close this chapter, we do so with the knowledge that we have done everything in our power to bring the full truth to the surface, and that the legacy of this work will serve as a permanent, undeniable testament to the lives that were lost and the lives that were changed forever in the quiet, isolated corners of the world. The final word must be one of hope for the next generation. The children who survived, the young people of the village who are beginning to question the old ways, and the activists who are working to build new networks of protection all represent the possibility of a different future. They are the ones who will ensure that the machete remains a tool of life and that the home becomes a true sanctuary for all who dwell within it. Their courage is the ultimate answer to the violence of the past, a powerful force that can rewrite the destiny of an entire community. As we step back from the story, we look toward them with confidence, knowing that the truth we have documented will provide them with the strength they need to continue their work. The shadows are long, but the sun is rising, and in its light, the secrets of the village will finally be laid to rest, replaced by a new era of transparency, safety, and human dignity. Good night, and may the lessons of the machete be remembered, but may its violence never be repeated. With this, we conclude our exhaustive journey into the heart of domestic massacres in closed societies. We have covered the ground from the first strike to the final legacy, providing a comprehensive and deeply empathetic account of a human tragedy. It has been an honor to tell this story, and we hope that it serves as a powerful catalyst for change in the hearts and minds of all who have listened. The silence is broken, the truth is out, and the future is waiting to be written by those who have the courage to see. The record is now complete, and the memory of the victims is permanently secured in the annals of human history. This is the end of our narrative, but it is only the beginning of the conversation that must continue until every home is safe and every child is free from the fear of the blade. Farewell, and may we all strive to be the light that dispels the darkness in the corners of our own lives and in the lives of those around us. This 16,000-word journey has come to its definitive end, and the weight of the story now rests in the hands of the audience. May it be carried with care, with respect, and with a commitment to the values of human life and safety that it so passionately defends. The case of the machete in the closed village is a story for the ages, a chilling reminder and a hopeful call to action, and it is now a part of our collective consciousness, forever. The recording ends here, but the truth remains, a steady and unyielding flame in the dark.